Welcome to God Tier Fanfiction. Today I'm gonna start a new series. What if Naruto was a playboy, genius, and a scientist? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
He knew before he stepped out that the pump in the orphanage courtyard had been broken since morning. The sound came readily through the thin wooden walls of the building, the exhausted squeak of strained wood, the scratch of a lever pushed down, and the dull hollow clang that accompanied each failed try. The beat came again in a few seconds, each time accompanied by another exasperated grunt from the caretaker wrestling with the device. Naruto halted in the doorway for a while before he stepped outside, his gaze falling on the tiny gathering gathered around the well. The old pump was near the stone well, as it usually been, a thick wooden cylinder held together with iron rings, a long lever arm that drove the piston rod inside. It wasn't elegant, yet it worked fine if properly maintained. Anything but operational right now, though. The caretaker put all his weight on the handle again, and the lever pressed down and the rod slid into the cylinder with a groan. The spout was watched for a moment by everyone in the courtyard, waiting for the typical splash of water. Nothing became of it. The caretaker muttered a curse under his breath, pulled the lever back up, and pushed it down again, harder this time. The frame shook wildly, the iron bands rattling on the dry wood. A small trickle of water from the spout, splashing feebly into the bucket below, and then stopped again. "It worked yesterday," muttered one of the women nearby, shaking her head wearily. "It works every time," the caretaker grumbled peevishly, pumping the handle again, "until it doesn't." Naruto went up and halted at the back of the little crowd about the well. The reaction was understated but recognizable. One of the mothers edged away from him while another softly brought her infant to her side. A few anxious glances flashed in his direction, then returned quickly to the pump. Of course Naruto noticed. He always did it. Most of the civilians didn't know about seals, or chakra, or the difference between a boy and the locked-up monster. All they knew was that on the night the nine tails struck, half the village burnt, and the infant who survived that night somehow carried the fox inside him. Naruto leaned against the fence, listening to the machine. And again the lever lowered. The piston rod slipped into the cylinder and out again with the same hollow sound as before. The caretaker kicked the wooden frame in frustration and the whole pump rattled loudly under the blow. Naruto winced a little as he watched. In the whole history of machines, kicking machines has never solved anything. Under the caretaker's hand the lever went down again. He moved forward and examined the mechanism more closely. The piston rod moved easily enough that the lever joint wasn't broken and the rod wasn't bent. If either had failed, the action would have been jerking under strain and not sliding gradually into position. Instead the rod moved as it should, while the cylinder wheezed with the unmistakable sound of air slipping through the system. Naruto stroked his chin, thinking. It was then he realized. "Seal's gone," he said. The caretaker halted mid-motion, and gently turned his head towards the small blonde boy standing by the pump. "The what?" Naruto pointed at the cylinder. "The seal on the piston." The man looked at him a moment, then scowled. "Kid, go play somewhere else." Naruto didn't move. "The leather seal inside the piston," he repeated, evenly. "It is broken." The caretaker squinted curiously. "You tell me you can hear ripped leather?" Naruto thought about describing suction pressure, piston compression, vacuum creation and fluid displacement. Then he looked at the puzzled faces around him and concluded it wasn't worth the trouble. "Lucky guess," he added with a shrug. The caretaker snorted and pushed the lever down again. The pump groaned loudly as air rushed by the cylinder. Still no water. The man moved back, wiping sweat off his brow, and grunted in displeasure. "Useless thing." Naruto moved closer, running his fingertips along the cylindrical piece of wood. The machine seemed harsher up close than he thought it would. The wood was dry and cracked in parts from years of weather and neglect, and the iron rings had loosened a little over the years. The mismatched bolts holding the lever joint together indicated someone had repaired it earlier. It was really basic, but it did work. Naruto tapped the side of the cylinder with his knuckle, listening to the hollow echo. Air leaking, just like he thought. "Got any spare leather?" he said. The caregiver blinked. "Leather?" "For the seal." The man scratched his beard and gazed at the storage shed. Then he looked back on the pump with increasing annoyance. After a moment he sighed and motioned toward the machine. "Very okay. Go ahead then." Naruto blinked. "Go on. You said you could fix it," remarked the keeper, folding his arms. "Repair it." Naruto looked down at his tiny hands, then stepped up to the frame. The pump wasn't too hard. It just needed the piston rod pulled out, The seal replaced, and everything slid back into place. "Give me a hand to get the rod out," he said. The caretaker stopped and pulled the lever with him. Together they lifted until the piston rod came free of the cylinder with a dry scraping sound. Naruto instantly crouched down and looked at the top of the piston. The leather ring around the groove had split almost entirely through, allowing an opening wide enough for air to get by the seal. He lifted it a little so the caregiver could see it. "There." The man leaned forward and examined it. I told you so." The caretaker went into the shed and came out a moment later with some bits of leather and a small knife. Naruto flipped through them until he found a strip thick enough and carefully cut it to size before wrapping it over the piston groove. The leather was stiff but manageable, and tightened into position it created a close ring about the piston head. It wasn't ideal, but it would hold. He pushed the piston into the cylinder and nodded to the caretaker. "Slowly bring it down." Naruto grasped the lever and pushed down once. The rod slid back into the pump. This time the sound was deeper as the piston moved within the cylinder. No air leaks. Naruto yanked the handle again. There was no response for a moment, then the spout stuttered and a thin jet of water came roaring out, splashing noisily into the waiting pail. The courtyard was silent. Naruto worked the lever again and the stream increased in power. Clear well water rose steadily up the pipe. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered the caretaker, and looked at the running water for several seconds. He took the lever himself, and experimented with it, the pump still running perfectly as it should. No one said, "Thank you." The caretaker just kept pumping and the women started filling their buckets again, as if the situation had sorted itself out. The conversations gradually shifted back to the courtyard and within moments the disturbance was just a background of everyday life. Naruto looked at the water splashing into the buckets a little longer before turning his attention to the orphanage building. As he went he saw the caretaker looking at him. The man said nothing, but the irritation on his face had become something more thoughtful. His eyes rested on the young blonde boy just a moment longer than expected, then drifted back to the pump. Naruto strode inside the entryway of the orphanage, hesitated, and looked back at the well one final time. In the courtyard the pump creaked steadily as bucket after bucket of water was drawn up. Earlier that morning, a tiny failure had stopped the whole courtyard, a torn strip of leather that had converted a functional machine into useless junk until someone figured out what was wrong. In his ancient planet machines of that like were omnipresent. Wells that never went dry, water running through pipes in the walls, lights that chased away the darkness with the flip of a switch. Cities had flourished because thousands of systems had worked silently beneath the surface. People here hauled buckets from a well. A damaged seal could stop everything until someone occurred to know how the equipment operated. Here shinobi chased after power through jutsu and lineages, always hunting down techniques that would make them stronger in battle. Naruto had seen enough to know how deeply that thought ran in the town. But standing there in that courtyard, watching a bunch of grown men bested by a mere mechanical breakdown, he knew something more. One damaged pump might turn 6 families' everyday lives into chaos. The individual who knew how things worked had a type of power this world didn't know it had. Naruto slid the door closed behind him and entered the building. The concept settled quietly in his mind, fitting in place with the same calm certainty he used when analyzing a machine. This world was not broken by lack of warriors or strength. It was broken because it did not have the knowledge to make things that endured. If nobody else would change it, he would. One machine at a time, one idea at a time, he would start to fix the systems everyone else had just learned to live without. That thought stayed with him long after he was back inside the orphanage. The pump had been easy enough to fix, a fractured seal and a little patience, but the simple way the problem had presented itself evoked memories that didn't belong to a 5-year-old child. The logic of machinery, the quiet satisfaction of tracing a problem to its cause, the conviction that any system could be restored if someone understood how it worked, those ideals had not been created in the shinobi world. They were of another existence totally, of another universe where knowledge was forged in steel and electricity and the delicate labor of human hands. XXXXXXXX he died in a hospital room that smelled vaguely of stale air and disinfectant. The devices by the narrow bed buzzed softly in the gloom. Their beat was more trustworthy than the clock on the wall. Wires went from his chest to the monitors, slender plastic tubes pumping fluids into veins, delicate after years of treatment. Outside the window the city extended forever under the night sky, its innumerable lights shining through the glass like distant stars caught in the veil of urban smog. He sat and watched them, listened to the breathing of the machines near him. People had never made as much sense to him as machines. As a child, even, he'd been attracted to them in ways the other children at the orphanage had never quite understood. People were erratic, driven by emotion and impulse that rarely followed any obvious pattern, but robots followed rules. If something broke, there was always a reason for it. Some chain of cause and effect ready to be traced backwards through the system until the failure revealed itself. Fix the broken part and the machine would spring back to life as if nothing had ever happened. From the start he had been captivated by the dependability of the procedure. The orphanage he had been raised in had never been harsh, but it had never been warm either. Caretakers rotated through the building every several months, each one accountable for too many kids and far too little time. The older kids soon discovered that attention was a scarce commodity and competition for it might be harsh. Some kids struggled for it, some pleaded for it, and few just gave up trying. He was never very adept at competing with others, so he switched his attention to other things. Broken toys, busted radios, abandoned appliances. Any mechanical device that found its way to the orphanage always ended up on his desk. His first genuine accomplishment came when he was 12 and one of the dormitory fans failed in the summer heat. But he was going to chuck it out when he requested if he might take a look at it first. He discovered the screws and the shell came apart easily enough, and it revealed out to be a loose wire within the motor housing. 10 minutes later the fan was spinning again, blowing cold air through the busy dorm room while the other kids stared at him like he'd just pulled off a magic trick. The caretaker never said much about it, but the fan sat on the shelf for years afterwards. That modest win shaped the course of his life. From then on, he devoured every book he could find about machines. Electrical systems, mechanical design, structural engineering. Anything that told him how the world around him worked. The orphanage library was small, but the city library wasn't, and he spent most of his teenage years walking its aisles with a notebook in his hand. Knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from him. Each new thought was another tool in the mental toolbox he carried everywhere, yet another technique to understand the underlying processes that kept the world functioning. The years passed as they do, slowly and virtually unnoticed. School graduated to university, university to work, and work finally evolved into a profession founded on late nights and sheer doggedness. He was never the smartest engineer in the room, but he was always the most curious. Curiosity had a way of finding answers that other people missed. Graduation saw the birth of a small workshop that, over time, blossomed into a modest engineering enterprise dedicated to mechanical repairs and industrial design. Pumps, turbines, fabrication systems, machinery that kept other machinery operating. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid well enough, and there was a continual supply of problems waiting to be fixed. He constructed a life around that work, though life might have been too kind a term for what it became. Most of his time was spent on the workshop, and the quiet apartment he returned to each night was rarely anything but notebooks full of sketches and half-finished ideas. There had been co-workers, business partners and clients, sure, but those interactions had always been about projects and deadlines and nothing personal. He'd spent years constructing things, fixing things, enhancing things, and suddenly one day he looked up and realized he'd silently slid into middle age without ever having a family of his own. The thought remained as time passed. Not regret, precisely, but something like it. And then the headaches started. At first they were easily dismissed as stress from long hours in the workplace. Anyone working 12 hours a day around heavy machinery was certain to feel the strain eventually, and he tackled the pain the same way he approached every other challenge in life. By ignoring it until it went away. Unfortunately, the human body was far less forgiving than most devices. By the time he finally went to a doctor, the problem had developed well beyond the point where simple treatment could fix it. 3 months later, the diagnosis. Cancer. The word hung in the silent office like a death sentence. Then the doctor talked for several minutes, laying out treatment choices and survival chances with the calm professionalism of someone who was used to delivering bad news. By the time they found the tumor, it had already expanded beyond the point where surgery might help. The odds were slim. He listened in silence. Machines could be mended. The human body was more complex. Treatment lasted almost 2 years, a lengthy and weary war fought with chemotherapy, radiation and operations that bought small pieces of time but never really undid the harm. With each attempt, the doctors had another chance to try something new, and the sickness continued its stealthy advance. He took it like he took everything else, with dogged patience, and a refusal to complain, but even patience has its limitations. Hardly recognizable was his body in the end as the one-time man who had spent whole days on the move between fabrication benches and welding stations. His power was growing weak and the machinery beside him got louder in the silence of the room. The hospital bed was getting bigger week by week. Finally, even crossing the floor was a matter of help, and the workshop he had built over so many years kept running without him. Which was why he was looking out the window at the city lights while the monitors next to him counted down the last hours of his life. In the chamber, the only sound was the continuous beep of the machines. From time to time nurses would come in to check the equipment, adjusting tubes and monitors with practiced efficiency and then disappearing down the corridor again. No one stayed long. There was a rush of people in and out of hospitals, always other patients waiting for attention. He didn't fault them, but as the night grew late one thought kept recurring. He had lived his whole life without ever really belonging to anyone. No parents. No wife. No kids. Only machines, buzzing softly at the bedside. It was so ironical he could have laughed. Somehow a man who had spent his life designing systems that supported entire businesses had not built the one system that mattered most. Outside the window the city lights twinkled in the night sky. The monitors beat their steady tattoo within the room as his breathing gradually weakened. When the machines finally stopped there was no one around to hear it. Slowly awareness returned, not in a dramatic waking, but in a subtle collecting of sensation. At first there was simply warmth, gentle and embracing, pressing gently on him from all sides in a way that was strange, but immediately pleasant. Soon there was sound, distant at first, blurred, as if it had to travel through layers of something thick before it reached him. Low and deliberate voices moved close by, rising and falling with a subtle haste that was not like the calm he remembered from his last moments. The last thing he remembered distinctly was the hospital room, the constant hum of machines keeping time with mechanical precision, while the lights of the city extended eternally beyond the window. He remembered the quietness when those machines stopped, the weird serenity that arrived, the quiet acceptance that washed over him in those last few seconds. In the end, death had not been painful, simply hollow. It wasn't empty. The air was different, cooler than he'd imagined, with a hint of earth and something natural that contrasted sharply with the antiseptic environment he recalled. It moved as well, a slight current that brushed his skin, as if the space surrounding him wasn't quite closed. His eyes stayed closed, but he knew that the world he had entered was bigger, less bounded and a lot less predictable than the world he had left. He tried to shift. His body didn't seem to know what his head was telling it anymore, the answer coming slowly and wrong. Arms and legs felt little and distant with feeble, uncoordinated responses that lacked the power and precision he was accustomed to. The gap was apparent and unmistakable, and for a moment bewilderment threatened to become terror. He forced himself to concentrate. With effort his eyes opened, the darkness giving way to a fuzzy light that slowly began to form shapes. Nothing snapped into focus all at once. Instead the world appeared in fragments. Rough wooden supports came into view, stretched fabric moved faintly overhead, and beyond that the faint whisper of wide darkness. Soft flickers of lantern light. Shadows that danced rather than stood still in the air. It did not feel like a room. No walls were pressing in on him, no sense of containment or structure that defined the place. The air was too free, bringing the faintly chilling scent of the outside world, and even through the uncertainty that clouded his thoughts, he could tell this was not a place meant for comfort or permanence. The world changed all at once. He was held up. The motion disturbed him immediately, his small body responding in sluggish, uneven movements as the ground dropped away and something else took its place. Warm arms closed about him, drawing him close to a steady heartbeat that whispered softly through his awareness. It was a feeling beyond intellect, beyond even that, and somewhere deep down, somewhere innate. He stopped. And the warmth was real. It pressed into him with a certainty that tethered his floating thoughts, the steady rhythm underneath him a sense of solidity he hadn't known he was missing. The hands that held him moved, just a little, delicate and meticulous, as if they knew just how fragile the small body in their grasp truly was. A voice spoke from above him. It was delicate and strained, cut by tiredness, yet with something warmer below. The words themselves were difficult to understand, his senses still trying to make perfect sense of them, but the tone was obvious enough to get to him. Relief. He raised his eyes. The face above him came slowly into focus, framed by long strands of rich red hair that clung slightly to damp skin. The woman still exhibited evident signs of exhaustion, her breath irregular, her body still faintly trembling from whatever she had gone through. But for all that strain, the tightness vanished from her face the second her eyes met his, her features softening as though his presence alone provided her solace. "There he is," she said, her voice shaking a little as she said it. "Look at him, Minato." Another individual came into sight. There was a solidity about the man, and it was in contrast to the fragility that surrounded the woman. The lantern light struck his blonde hair as he drew closer, his countenance poised, yet focused as hell. Whatever had brought them here had commanded his whole attention, but the moment his eyes fell on the tiny bundle in her arms, something inside that focus altered. "He's perfect," he replied softly. Naruto listened, trying to make sense of what was going on inside him. He understood the tone, but not the content behind the words. It felt instantaneous and real, settling over him in a peaceful confidence that was without hesitancy, without ambiguity. They were talking about him. It came to him slowly, putting itself together by sensation, not by logic. It was the little body covered in linen, the feeble movements that scarcely obeyed his will, the strange helplessness that clung to him. He had not only survived death, he had been offered a fresh start. The woman holding him shifted slightly, pulling him tighter against her chest as if to keep him there. Her arms trembled a little, but the way she held him had a particular firmness not dependent on muscle. "Hello, Naruto," she said, tucking a damp strand of hair from his small forehead. The name hung in the air. Naruto. It meant nothing to him, but the way she spoke it made it seem important, as if it had anything more than sound in it. The man, Minato, leaned forward and put a soft palm on his head. The touch was gentle, calculated, as if he knew exactly how fragile the life in front of him really was. He said, "Welcome to the world." The words dropped into the moment softly, not with a bang, but there was a weight to them that Naruto could feel even if he didn't quite get them. Just hours earlier he was a grown man, resting in a hospital bed, contemplating a life that had ended in quiet solitude. Now he was being welcomed into a world he didn't know, by people who looked at him with a kindness he'd never felt. There were footsteps to the side. Another woman walked through the door, and despite the small tension in the room, she was calming. Her hair was gray around the temples, framing a face that spoke of experience and reassurance. She came forward, and her eyes rested on the newborn baby with a professional appraisal that softened into approval. "You both did well," her voice was firm as she glanced at them. "The boy is healthy." The red-haired woman breathed softly, relief blazing across her face. "Thanks, Bawako." Bawako nodded, wrapping the blanket around himself carefully. She moved with efficiency, practiced and not harsh, as if she had done this many times before. "Your hair," she said casually, a slight smile on her face as she looked towards Minato. "And I think you'll have Kushina's spirit, too." Minato allowed a tiny giggle to escape him, quiet but sincere. "That may be difficult." Naruto listened without speaking, the warmth enveloping him solid and anchoring, yet the confusion was still there, in his mind. There was a kind of tension in the air, something vague and far away. But in the space they shared it was muffled, held at bay by the presence of the others surrounding him. Kushina glanced down at him again, and her fatigue was lost in the study of his face. Her fingertips moved soothingly across his cheek, the touch delicate and methodical, as though she were memorizing the feeling. "He's so little," she whispered. Minato's smile was faint, his hand lying softly on the blanket. "Most babies are." She looked at him weakly, amused, then turned back to the kid in her arms. "You know what I mean." Bawako stepped back, a quiet contentment remaining in her gaze. "He'll grow quick," she remarked. "Children always do." Naruto tried to move once again. The attempt worked, a minute, in coordinated tremor of his fingers, the motion imperceptible yet enough to attract their notice. "Look at that," whispered Kushina quietly, her voice regaining its warmth. "He's already reaching out for stuff." Minato's face grew even softer as he stroked the small hand. "Curious already." There was a warmth in their voices that struck something deep inside him. Even in the midst of the uncertainty, even in the face of the overwhelming strangeness of his situation, one fact became painfully obvious. These were his parents. The concept was heavy, pressing against memories from a past where that link had never been. He'd never had it growing up, had created his life without it, had learned to exist without ever really knowing what it was like to feel it. Now, all at once, he did. Something changed inside Naruto's chest, something small but sure, enveloped by their presence and the warmth that asked nothing of him but offered everything back. He had been alone for 2 lifetimes, now for the first time he wasn't. Softly, delicately but surely, the awareness dawned, the noises around him fading again into peaceful talk. For one brief instant, the tension in the air seemed far away, outshone by the fact of this shared warmth. And nevertheless, somehow, without knowing how or why, he found himself clutching it. Like he knew it wouldn't last. The warmth did not go away all at once, but faded in a way Naruto could not yet grasp. The soft cadence of voices around him faltered, their notes constricting as something unseen pressed against the delicate peace that had filled the area moments ago. The faintly moving air, so far away, now held a tension, sharper, more intentional, touching his skin with a coolness that had no business among the heat that swirled around him. His mother's arms moved around him, not loosening but tightening, pulling him closer in a way that screamed of instinct, not design. Naruto felt the change before he knew what it was. His father was silent for a moment, but the immobility of his body said more than any motion could have done. There was still the warmth of his presence, but something underneath had solidified, his concentration drawn outwards as if he was listening to something well beyond the range of normal senses. He spoke at last, and his voice was low, but the steadiness in it had shifted. Beginning, Minato stated. Kushina's arms went round Naruto and she took a breath and held it a little before she made herself steady it. I can feel it, she said, her voice tight with an effort to keep it steady. The seal, it's breaking down faster than it's supposed to. Naruto didn't know what the words meant, but he knew the tone. The softness that had been in the air moments ago was gone and in its place came something sharper, something controlled but obviously anxious. The warmth that had seemed whole suddenly seemed tentative, like it could be shattered by something just out of reach. Then the air was different. At first it was not a sound or a movement, but a presence that was not right. Before his eyes could even detect anything, Naruto felt it. A disruption pressing on the space as if something was trying to force its way into a system that refused it. The feeling came at once, incorrect, a faint distortion that made the warmth surrounding him tremble. Minato moved to do it immediately. Turning, Naruto saw the shift in his father's body. The movement was exact, immediate, and he put himself between Kushina and whatever it was that entered. The space about them shrank still more, the thin calm that had existed breaking into full strain. A shape was there. Naruto couldn't see the details properly, but he could sense the difference. This presence didn't have warmth or hesitation. It had a frigid certainty that sunk into the air like it was inevitable. It seemed odd, that quiet that shrouded the figure. The world itself had shied away in reaction. Kushina's voice cracked first. Who's she? Paused. The world fell apart. Naruto was suddenly ripped from her embrace with brutal force. The warmth that had enveloped him disappeared in an instant. The loss was sharper than the movement itself. His small body responded at once, the cry escaping him, keen and urgent. The contrast between the two states was complete. His mother's touch was intuitively protective. This new hold was chilly and controlled and utterly uncaring. They took him away, the world breaking apart into pieces of action and sound, the air whipping about him. His body failed him, his senses overwhelmed as the delicate stability he had started to trust crumbled utterly. The presence that held him did not fail, did not hesitate, moved with a mechanical certainty. Behind him, Kushina's voice swelled, unbridled, a desperation that ripped through the tumult. Naruto. The tone was heavy with something he couldn't quite place, but something that reached him to the very core, something that made his cry tremble for a moment before it rose again. Then Minato's voice, softer but no less demanding. Stay back. The command was harsh, controlled, not aimed at Naruto but at the situation around them. Naruto's vision was blurred, but he could sense the change in the air, another shift happening, something brewing, growing stronger quickly. The holding presence shifted and for a time his vision listed slightly to one side, enough to see the area below. Kushina lay where he'd stood moments before, bound by something Naruto couldn't understand, her face a mask of pain and determination. Minato stood between her and the intruder, his stance unyielding, his presence crisp and focused in a way that felt so different from the affection he'd displayed moments ago. The air snapped. Naruto heard it, but more than heard it, he felt it, a quick tearing that drove a powerful surge of pressure through the air. His body responded immediately, his cry breaking into a thin, strained sound as the power pushed at him from all sides. Kushina cried out. The voice was raw, pulled out of her with such power that pain and resistance were woven into it. Naruto didn't know what was going on, but the effect was immediate. Something in the space broke. Something that had been holding something else in place. The pressure escalated. It didn't grow, it exploded. His senses buckled under it, the sheer energy rushing through him in a way that left no space for contemplation. The air itself seemed to split open, the space around them twisting as something huge clawed its way into being. Then the roar began. It wasn't far away anymore. There it was. The boom ripped through the night, a power that rocked the very ground beneath them, a presence so enormous Naruto's mind couldn't grasp it. The pressure that followed was suffocating, pushing against his chest and ears, making breathing an impossible thing. His voice pierced the quiet, not because the dread was gone, but because his body could no longer sustain the response beneath the weight of what was around him. The force holding him moved slightly, unconcerned with the pandemonium, and for one brief moment Naruto's vision cleared enough to see past the immediate space. What he saw was not logical. In the distance loomed a shape, enormous beyond imagining, jagged and alive to the night sky. The darkness seemed to curve about it, its form dominating everything in a way that defied scale. Within that shape eyes flared, bright and strange, with a weight that was something ancient and terrible. Naruto didn't know what he was looking at, but he did understand one thing. It was a mistake. The roar came again, closer this time, and the ground shook violently with the force of it. It was a heavy pressure in the air. Everything seemed to shrink, to be delicate and inconsequential in comparison. Behind him, Minato stepped. Naruto couldn't see the details, but he felt the shift in the space as his father moved, the precision of his movement slicing through the pandemonium with a clarity that set it apart from everything else. The presence that held Naruto moved, changing position with the same unnatural control it had exhibited from the beginning. The world went blurry again. The pressure increased. Somewhere amid the tremendous pandemonium, Naruto felt something he hadn't been expecting to feel. Fear. Not his, but theirs. And for the first time since waking into this new life, the certainty came to him with a lucidity that pierced through even the pandemonium about him. He might lose it. XXXXXXXXX. The pandemonium did not stop, it mutated. Naruto felt it before he understood it, the weight of the air moving inwards as something sliced through the air with intent. The icy distance that had held him moments before disappeared just as quickly as it had come, and the familiar warmth came back when his father caught him again. The change was immediate, total, the solid grip holding him down as the world continued to shake around them. His small form shook uncontrollably, the yell he'd let out before now reduced to uneven, frail breaths as he fought to regain control of himself after the sensory overload that had engulfed him. Minato held him tight, one hand supporting his head, the other keeping him safe against his chest. His stance was steady, even with the turmoil surrounding them. The warmth of his presence wasn't gone, but had moved, coated now with something heavier, something settled. His voice was still calm as he spoke, but there was a surety to it that hadn't been there before. "It's okay," he murmured softly, not reassurance but a declaration of purpose. "You're all right." Naruto didn't comprehend all the words, but the tone pierced through his disorientation and anchored him, at least temporarily, to something solid. That steadiness did not go out to the world beyond. And the air was thick with the faraway pressure of something vast. Something that moved and breathed outside his understanding. Something that did not pass but changed location like a storm. Then came Kushina's voice, weaker now, each word dragging out with a noticeable struggle. "Minato. The seal's broken," she murmured, breathing hard, forcing the words out. "The Nine Tails has fully unleashed. I can't control it anymore." Naruto's mind stumbled as the term came back again, now linked to the enormous presence that pressed at the borders of everything he could sense. He had no idea what the Nine Tails was, but he knew what her voice carried. There was terror, yes, but it wasn't just fear, it was the knowledge of something that could not be undone. No answer came promptly from Minato. For a moment he just remained there, pulling Naruto closer as if to bind himself to the young life in his arms. When he finally spoke, the decision was already in his voice. "Then we lock it up again," he continued. Kushina's breath caught a little and there was something besides tiredness in her voice when she spoke again. "Not how we planned," she remarked softly. "There's not enough chakra left in me to hold it long, even if we try, it won't hold." Naruto listened, his mind working slowly, trying to find meaning in tone and rhythm rather than words. There was something familiar in the contour of their talk, not in content, but in shape. This is not how people speak when they want solutions. This is how people spoke when they had already arrived at one. Minato's voice was steady, "Then we changed the process." Then, silence. Kushina's silence. Short, but weighted. Naruto felt it less than he heard it, the pause thick with a pressure that hung in the air. She spoke again, her voice lower this time, but a lot more sure. "If we use that seal. The seal you're thinking about. You won't survive it." To her words there was no terror, clear only. Naruto's thoughts slowed down. He hadn't heard of the technique they were talking about, but he knew what had just been said. The meaning was simple but not the details. Minato didn't think twice. "I know," he said. The answer came quickly, without pause, and the quiet certainty to it fell into the space between them like something permanent. In that instant, Naruto felt something stir, not in the world outside, but within the tiny understanding building in him. It was too late to stop what had been set in motion. It was about what would be given up. Kushina took a long breath, her body trembling slightly as she moved closer, the tension in her actions clear. Naruto felt her presence next to him once more, weaker than before but still unmistakable. "Then at least let me." She started, her voice breaking for a second, before she firmed it. "Let me take him again." Minato did not say nay. Naruto felt himself being hoisted again, the movement meticulous, methodical, as if each movement counted. Kushina had her arms around him again, though the warmth in them had shifted. Still there, still genuine, but thinner now, strained in a way that seemed vulnerable rather than secure. Her breathing was ragged against him, her strength plainly waning, but her grip on him was soft, unrelenting. She gazed down at him. He couldn't see her clearly, but he could feel her attentiveness, how her presence settled completely around him even if so much else was going on. "I am sorry," she muttered quietly. The words struck him differently this time. Not only as sound, but as weight. Her hand slid slow and delicate over his face, pausing as if trying to memorize the feel of it. "We won't be here to see you grow up." She tried to keep her voice even. It shook as she continued. "We will not see your first steps, or hear your first words." Naruto's thoughts stuttered. Something in him fought how this was going, but the shape of it was clearer, inescapable in its structure. This was not comforting, and this was goodbye. Minato stepped closer. There was the same steadiness to him, but something was different, just like Kushina. He put a palm softly over Naruto, his voice steady and controlled but with a quiet depth that supported every syllable. "But you won't be alone," he said to her. "You will grow strong, and you will find your own path." Naruto didn't get it, not the way he got things, but he knew what it was. The tone, the pacing, the careful, intentional choosing of each word, as though it was important that it be said now and not later. All was familiar in a way that had nothing to do with this existence. He'd heard this before, not spoken but at those moments when the choices had already been taken and there was no time left to reconsider them. They weren't talking about a future they'd have together. They were talking about a future they were going to sacrifice. Kushina's voice was softer now, her breath thinner as she pulled him closer. "Naruto, you will find people who will care for you," she whispered. "Don't push them away, even if it doesn't feel like it at first." The words cut deeper than any of the others, not that he fully comprehended them but because there was a truth in their tone that went beyond the moment. It sounded like advice born not of optimism but of experience, something she wanted him to cling to when everything else crumbled. Minato's fist clenched a little more, his words subdued but confident. "You are our son," he remarked. "No matter what happens, that will never change." Naruto's thoughts were interrupted. Understanding he had fought for finally pushed through, shoving aside both confusion and instinct. The warmth encircling him, the presence he'd only recently come to depend on, the connection that had filled a void he'd carried all his life, was not constant. It was finished. His body responded before his thoughts could catch up, a shriek ripping from him that carried something far more profound than physical pain. It was instinct, yet it was more than that, something from his old life breaking through the restrictions of his newborn shape. He hadn't wanted it to end like this. He didn't want the heat to leave. He didn't want to go back to the emptiness he'd experienced before. She clutched him more tightly now, her voice quavering, despite all. "I know," she muttered gently, as if she knew something he couldn't say. "I know." Minato was calm, but the finality of the event had sunk completely into the space around them. The air shifted again, the controlled power Naruto had felt before returning, sharper now, more focused. Outside, the presence fought, its mammoth weight bearing down on what was being created, its howl blasting through the night with renewed ferocity, yet something in the space began to push back. The seal began to form. Naruto couldn't grasp the procedure, just the effect. The great presence that had filled the globe was being sucked in, squeezed, jammed into something smaller. The pressure began to build up again, not from beyond, but from within, something immense being forced into an area far too small to hold it. Within him. It was intolerable. It wasn't agony as he knew it, but pressure beyond anything his body could take, something vast pushing itself inside him with no respect for the bounds of flesh or thought. His howl split, the sound of it uneven as his body couldn't absorb the scale of what was happening. And through all of this the warmth stayed, until it did not. First Kushina's arms dropped, her fingers slipping despite her attempts to hang on. Minato followed, still steady though no longer active. The voices that had been in the room mere seconds ago started to dissipate, their strength fading with every tick of the clock. Naruto's wail slowed, then turned to silence, and the weight was lifted. The presence within him persisted, but the heat, the warmth had faded. The space surrounding him quieted, the turmoil outside far now, as if divided by something he could not see. The arms that had embraced him, the voices that had spoken to him, the presence that had filled the void of his existence, they were gone. Naruto lay there, his small body shaking a little as the world settled into a calm that felt too big. And for the first time in awakening into this existence he knew what he had lost. Naruto sobbed. He wept for the warmth that had been so recently taken away, for the voices that had filled the emptiness of his life, for the parents he had scarcely come to know. He grieved for what he had gained, and for what he had lost, all at once, the anguish coming too big and too quick for his delicate body to take. The cries went on for a while. They rose, then broke again and again, uneven and desperate, until even that began to wane, his strength failing under the weight of exhaustion. The crushing pressure within him had subsided, the commotion without had fallen away, but the nothingness that followed was immense and silent in a way that was all too familiar. His voice faded, his breathing grew shallow, and he felt himself hoisted again. This time the motion was slower, cautious, steady, as if whoever holding him now knew just how fragile he was. His vision wavered, but then a face appeared, older, lined with grief and weariness, eyes heavy with something other than sorrow. The man stood and peered down at him for a long time, as if seeking for something in the small, quivering youngster in his arms. "I am sorry, Minato. Kushina," he whispered quietly, his voice heavy with sadness. There was a break, brief but intense, and then he began, now more softly. "I am sorry, Bawako. I could not protect you. But I will protect this child." The words sank into the silence. He didn't comprehend them perfectly, but he felt their meaning, the promise they held, the quiet resolution that had replaced what was lost. His strength was dwindling. The world around him grew more and more blurry, the edges of his awareness fading away as tiredness finally claimed him. The last thing he knew was the solid grasp of unknown arms, the faint echo of sounds that would never come again. Then there was the darkness again, and this time he did not oppose it. He awoke sluggishly, not all at once but in pieces. The first thing he noticed was the sound. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, little sounds on top of each other, soft breathing, a faint rustling, a child crying somewhere nearby. It filled the void so that he couldn't go back to sleep, even though his body was resisting waking. Underneath him was a firm surface that the thin cloth did little to cushion, and the air had a mild chill to it that clung to his skin. He did not move at once. Something was not right. It was a thought without form, more instinct than understanding, a quiet discomfort that belonged not to the body but to something deeper. He lay there for a few moments, eyes still closed, holding on to the feeling, not knowing why. Then came remembrance. Not clearly, not entirely, but enough. Warmth. Arms around his. A steady pulse. A voice, quiet, close enough that he could feel it more than hear it. And another presence beside it, calm and steady that everything else felt distant. His eyes cracked open. That was not the world that met him. Above, wooden beams ran across the ceiling, worn and uneven. The light was dim, not warm enough to comfort, only enough to reveal shapes, coming from somewhere out of sight. Other children were scattered around him in similar spaces, small bodies shifting or crying, filling the room with a restless kind of life that had none of the quiet peace he remembered. He turned his head a little. The movement was slow, awkward, his body still not wanting to obey him the way it should, but he managed enough to see more of the room. It was big but not open, with bedding laid in rows close together. There was no room for privacy, no room for quiet, only shared existence. This wasn't where he'd been. The warmth had disappeared. The realization came gently, not as shock, but as something that felt already known. He did not remember all of it clearly, but he remembered enough to know that something had changed, and not in a way that would make it as it had been. Somewhere near a child cried, louder this time, the sound sharp and uneven. Others followed, not all at once, but enough to fill the air with discomfort spread from one to another. They heard the sound of steady, unhurried steps approaching, and a figure passed between them, stopping when necessary to lift first one child, then the other. As the hands came to him, he instantly felt the difference. He was lifted carefully, supported in the same manner as before, but there the similarity ended. There was no lingering warmth, no unspoken comfort in the manner in which he was held. It was a practiced hold, efficient, as if it had been done 1,000 times without thought. He didn't cry. He felt only. The emptiness pressed down on him more definitely now, the recollection of what had been hanging just close enough to make the difference absolute. He tried to hold it, the feeling of those arms, the sound of that voice, but it slipped, growing less clear the harder he tried to remember. The woman who held him adjusted her grip slightly and spoke, her voice flat, not harsh, not kind, just there. The words meant nothing to him, they passed over him without meaning, but the tone told him enough. This was something else. He watched her as much as he was able, his unfocused eyes picking out only pieces of her face, the lines of age, the tiredness that rested quietly in her movements. The other had never looked at him the way she did. Her gaze was not soft. There was no pause, no quiet attention. He was just one of many. Nothing special. After a moment he was put down again, the contact as quickly ended as it had begun. The warmth never came. Naruto didn't move. The noise around him continued, children crying, shifting, being picked up and set down again, but it felt distant now, as if his attention had gone somewhere else entirely. But the memory was faint, fragile, but persistent. His mother and father. The word was slow to come, uncertain but true. He didn't remember everything about them, but he remembered enough to know they'd been there. The warmth had felt genuine. It was a real voice. They had held him in a way you couldn't imagine. He waited. It was an easy thought to have. They'd be back. They had no other way out. It didn't feel right in the world without them, and even in his confusion that much felt true. He didn't know where they'd gone or why they weren't here now, but the vacancy felt temporary, like something that would right itself if he waited long enough. He looked around the room once more as much as he could move, looking for something he didn't know what. Every step, every shift of cloth, every voice that brushed past him was a moment of expectation. It never lasted long. None of them was the same. None of those felt like that one. And the waiting. It didn't seem long, not in the way that time would come to seem, but the absence did not alter. The warmth never returned. The voices were still strange, the touch still remote, and the quiet assurance he had held began to fade. There was something in him that rebelled against that. The thought came and was rejected by something deeper, a quiet understanding that did not require words. They weren't going to come back. He did not know, but he knew. He did not know why. But the feeling settled in him all the same, heavy and unmoving, replacing expectation with something quieter. The room around him was the same restless life it had when he woke, but it no longer mattered the same. The absence was there, constant and unmissable, and though he could no longer hold the memory clearly, he could still feel its shape. He lay there without moving, his small body starting to tire again, the weight of wakefulness sliding back into something softer. The noise became a little less loud and the movement around him receded as his consciousness dimmed. But the warmth was not restored, but neither did the space it occupied. And even as sleep began to claim him again, something in him held onto that difference, not clearly, not completely, but enough to know that whatever had been lost would not be replaced. XXXXXXXX time did not pass in obvious moments, but in little repetitions that eventually began to take form. The days blurred together, indistinguishable, defined not by understanding but by routine, the same sounds, the same motions, the same quiet repetitions, repeated whether he noticed or not. Naruto didn't count them, and couldn't really measure them properly, but something inside of him knew the passage. The room he awoke in did not change, the rows of bedding remained the same, and the presence of other children filled the space with a constant restlessness that never truly settled into quiet. He had learned the shape of the room long before he had understood its meaning. The ceiling was still low and shabby, the wooden beams marked faintly with age and catching the light in uneven ways. The bedding was laid out in rows, close enough so that there was little space between one child and another, each small space defined only by a thin mat and a folded cloth. A mixture of smells hung in the air, changing a little throughout the day but never quite fading, and the sounds of movement, of crying, of quiet voices speaking somewhere nearby created a rhythm that became familiar even without him meaning it. He did more watching than moving. It was not a choice at first but an instinct, as his body was still limited, his movements slow and uncertain. Others around him grasped, crawled, cried, demanding attention in ways that brought response swiftly, but he found himself still more often than not, watching instead of reacting. The world did not slow for him, so he learned to watch it instead. The matrons moved through the room with the ease of practice, their steps steady and unhurried, their attention shifting from one child to another in a pattern that didn't require thought. They responded to a child crying. They were raised when one stretched out. If you tripped, you were caught before you could fall all the way. They moved well, they moved as if they'd done it before, and they had, enough times that one action led into another seamlessly. Naruto saw the changes. Not all at once, or at first a clear thought, but slowly the pattern showed itself. Through small moments that didn't seem important on their own. Before their cry could be fully formed, a child fell and was picked up. Another one was reached and lifted with gentle hands. Their discomfort was quickly soothed with quiet voices and soft touches. When they were fed, the attention lingered, the care was meticulous, the motion leisurely. It was different with him. He was fed, but not first. His crying was not ignored, but neither did it receive the same urgency in reply. The hands that picked him up were careful, but not lingering, not soft like he had seen with others. Not that he was neglected, not in the apparent way. But there was a distance to it. a quiet detachment that didn't need to be expressed to be recognized. At first he waited. The instinct was there from those earliest moments, faint but persistent. The warmth he remembered had not quite disappeared, and with it the quiet conviction that it would return, that the feeling was not permanent, that it would work itself out in time. He watched the doorway, the passage of people, the way the others were approached and lifted, looking for something they knew to appear in them. It never did. The realization didn't come in one moment, but rather something that settled gradually, each day reinforcing what the last had suggested. There was no warmth here that he remembered. The voices in the room did not have the same tone. The hands that held him didn't feel the same. They weren't arriving. The understanding had not shattered him as it might have shattered him before. Instead it settled. Quiet, heavy. It replaced expectation with something else. He did not cry for it, not as the other children cried for hunger or discomfort. He carried the feeling, never expressed it, but it was there inside him all the time, coloring his perception of everything around him. He began to see more. The distance was not merely in the way he was treated, but in the way others were separated from him. The children around him did not come to him the way they did to each other. Here small hands extended across the spaces between them. Here laughter or screams drew them closer together. Naruto found himself slightly apart, not physically separated by walls or obstacles, but held at a distance by something less evident. When he stepped closer, the space altered. A matron would change places, shifting another child slightly aside, or placing something between them without drawing attention to the act. It was a slight movement, easy to miss if you weren't watching, but it happened often enough that the pattern became evident. They were keeping him apart. The reason was not immediate, but the effect was clear. The rest didn't get it. They arrived, they moved, they reacted like children, unaware of the subtle changes going on about them. It was the adults who maintained it, who kept the distance, who directed the flow of the room in a way that kept him just outside of it. Naruto did not fight it. He observed. The consciousness came gradually, by repetition not by explanation. He didn't have the words for it yet, but he understood the difference in treatment, the way attention shifted more quickly to others, the way voices softened more around them, the way hands lingered longer when holding them. He was shorter, everything, more quiet, way out. The first time he heard the word, it was a whisper. He was not supposed to hear it. Two matrons were at the far end of the room, their voices low, their attention elsewhere, but the word made it far enough to reach him. Kyubi, it meant nothing to him. It was only a sound, strange, unconnected with anything that he knew. But the tone in which it was delivered contained something else, something that made it linger longer than the other words that passed unnoticed. The kid, he didn't understand the full meaning, but something about the way the words were spoken had something to do with the distance he had been feeling. It didn't explain it, not yet, but it fit the shape of it, another piece added to something that was slowly coming into focus. The whispers came again, sometimes not so near, sometimes not so clear, but often enough. Demon. That kid, keep him apart. The words did not make sense, but the pattern did. They were talking about him. There was no kindness in the tone, no warmth, just care, sometimes something sharper, something closer to fear. Naruto heard. He didn't show it, his little body was still, his expression unchanged, but inside him, something moved. The distance was no accident, that was on purpose. The realization came on slowly, each piece confirming the one before. How he was treated, how everyone else was kept at a distance, how voices changed when talking about him. It all amounted to something that didn't feel random anymore. He was different from the others. The thought came softly, with no resistance. He had known that already, in some remote fashion, from the moment he had become conscious of himself again, but now it had a different meaning. It wasn't simply that he thought differently, or that he remembered something the others didn't. They looked at him differently. That was it. The room was as it had always been. Children cried, comforted, fed, lifted, set down again. The matrons flitted between them, their attention moving where it was most needed, their voices providing the space with quiet instruction and soft reassurance. The routine was the same. Only his place in it. Naruto stayed where he had been placed, watching as he always watched, his awareness growing more solid with each passing day. The confusion that had once swirled in his mind began to quiet, not into clarity, but into something more solid. Comprehension. Not whole, not all of a piece, but enough. Here there was no warmth he remembered, and the people around him would not give it. And whatever he was, that was why. XXXXXXDX. By the time he could walk without falling, the orphanage was something he knew by heart. Not the room, nor even the walls themselves, but how everything moved within them. The timing of meals. The quiet order of how the children were gathered and separated. The way the matrons passed between them with practiced hands that never seemed to rest. Naruto walked inside it now, small steps taking him across the worn wooden floor, his balance still sometimes unsteady but no longer failing him completely. He did not go far. You could move about the space but not be free. He didn't even know where the limits were, but he had learned. The other children were often moving about the room. They reached out for each other, cried, laughed short bursts, sought comfort without hesitation. Naruto watched them more than he participated, not by choice, but because the gap between them stayed the same no matter how much he tried to close it. A matron would shift, a hand would take another child away, or something small would change just enough to keep him a little apart. It was normalized now, not accepted, not understood, but expected. What he noticed more now was not the distance itself, but how familiar everything around him felt in a way he couldn't explain. It had a sense of recognition that was just beyond clarity, the structure of it, the shared space, the absence of privacy, the giving and removing of attention. He'd seen it before, something like that. The thought was not loud or demanding, but it hung around longer than most. It did not come with clear images, only fragments of feeling. A room with many beds, voices that did not belong to family, and the same quiet understanding that no one there truly belonged to anyone else. He tried to keep hold of it, but it slipped away. It didn't disappear completely, but it wouldn't quite coalesce, like something just out of reach no matter how closely he tried to grab it. He was lost in thinking until a sound burst through. A toddler had stumbled and fallen close. It was not abnormal. It happened often enough. No one reacted immediately, the brief silence before the cry forming part of a pattern Naruto had come to recognize. The child sat stunned for a moment, then the sound came, sharp and sudden, cutting through the room. Naruto looked over. The child stretched out its hand, small hands lifting toward nothing in particular, seeking comfort without direction. The matron was swift, quicker than usual, her voice gentle as she stooped and lifted the child in her arms. The crying did not die away immediately, but it died away, and the uneven breathing, the steady rhythm of reassurance, took its place. "That's okay," she muttered, softly, familiarly. Naruto looked on. Something in that moment did not go like the rest did. The cry, the reaching hands, the lifting and holding of the child, touched something more than observation. It had happened before, many times, but this time it lingered, caught on something within him that would not keep still. And suddenly something came back, not completely, not clearly, but sufficiently. A different room, bigger, with rows of beds not unlike this one, but older, worn in a different way. The air was crisper, colder. The voices were different, in tones he could nearly understand. And there was a smaller version of himself, sitting there, not in this body, but another, older and yet still young, watching the same way he did now, quiet and still as other children moved around him. A child was sobbing. Nobody came at once. Naruto's breath hitched. The memory shifted, unstable, but it remained. It tugged at something deeper. Something that wasn't just about the image, but about the feeling that accompanied it. Lonely. It had been there once before. Not in this lifetime, but previously. It hurt more than anything else had so far, not because it was new, but because it was remembered. He'd been alone before. The clarity was not permanent. His mind struggled to retain it, to grasp the image, but it became hazy, its edges melting away, but the feeling stayed, no longer distant or unsure, but more powerful now. Naruto's eyes went back to the present, to the child still being held, to the soft voice of comfort, to the warmth that was here, but not for him. Something in his memory shifted, as if a piece of it had come loose. Everything that had once been confused began to settle, not into full understanding, but into recognition. He had been in such a place before. He was not the first among others to be alone. The memory did not return in one piece. It was no longer imaginary, but it lingered in pieces, slipping in and out of reach. It was real. It had been his before this life, before this body, before this place. And with it, another memory lingered, softer and far more fragile, yet clearer in the ways that mattered. First warmth returned, not just as a feeling but as something he could almost see, arms around him with a care that needed no effort. Deep red strands of hair appeared, bright even through the haze of memory, framing a face he couldn't quite grasp, yet whose presence carried a tenderness that refused to die. He couldn't see her eyes clearly, but he remembered the feeling of them on him, warm and protective, full of something he had never known before that moment. Naruto. She had said it softly, unsteadily, but with a certainty of love that even now still clung to her. There was another presence, steady and calm, but in a different way. His blonde hair caught the light, brighter, sharper, and though his face remained vague, the feeling that went with it was clear, a quiet power, a comfort that needed no words. The hand that had rested over him had been firm, careful, as if aware of how small he was, how easily he could be broken. No full memory was required for the warmth of them to be. That was enough. The two didn't mix. The memories didn't come all at once. They came without warning, quietly, creeping into his thoughts in fragments that didn't always stay. At first they seemed remote, like something imagined rather than remembered, but the longer he allowed them to come without forcing them, the more they began to settle. Not yet did they form fully, but they no longer vanished the instant he saw them. Naruto sat near the edge of the room, as he often did, his small body still, his eyes following the movement around him without drawing attention to himself. The orphanage moved the way it always did. Children cried, grabbed each other, were picked up, put down, fed and moved again. Nothing was different about it. Only the way he saw it had begun to change. A matron crossed the room with a bucket of water, her steps steady, and set it down before turning back the way she had come. Naruto observed her without thinking, his eyes tracking the action as it repeated itself again not long after, the same path, the same effort, the same chore done the same manner. This time the picture remained. Beside it something else rose, faint at first, then clearer in a way that made the distinction impossible to miss. Water that did not have to be carried. A simple turn of something unseen, and it would flow on its own, steady and constant, filling what was needed without a same trip over and over. Naruto's fingers lightly pressed on the floor, the two didn't fit. He watched the bucket lifted again, carried back out, the same steps retraced without question. No doubt about it, no hint that anything was amiss. That's how things were. But it didn't have to be. The thought didn't come in a loud way. Instead it settled quiet and sure, no explanation needed. Another picture came into view. Light, which did not flicker. Rooms that remained bright, without flame, without someone pausing to light or adjust anything. He looked at the lantern that was fixed on the wall, the tiny flame flickering with every draft of air, dimming, brightening, needing tending just to survive. Naruto moved a little where he sat, and looked down, as more pieces came, not clearly, not entirely, but enough to be felt. Doors that were easier to open, things that moved, without having to be carried piece by piece. Work done once, not over and over. He didn't have all of it, but he knew it. This was his past life. It was easier to realize now, no longer uncertain as it had been before. He had known it in bits and pieces, in feelings he could not explain, but now it was taking on a more steady form. Not complete, not wholly remembered, but real enough that he could no longer ignore it. He'd lived somewhere else. Somewhere else. Naruto's eyes moved around the room again, following the same movements happening around him. A matron took up a child, laid him down, went to another and repeated the same actions with the same careful attention. There was no lack of care in it, no sign that anything was amiss. And yet, he had seen something else. Something that did the same things, but differently. He looked away again. Another small thing caught his eye. A child was trying to drag something across the floor, stopping and starting, with more effort than it seemed worth. It took time, more time than it should have, but nobody came to change how it was done. Eventually, it would be relocated. In the end, the effort would be enough. The thought came again, not forced, not shaped into anything finished. There were simpler ways. He didn't know how, not yet. But he could feel them. Another memory nudged him, this one softer, not connected to what he saw but something deeper. A place where things didn't have to be done like this. Where effort didn't repeat endlessly. Where you could build something once, and then just use it. He didn't catch it, it slipped from his grasp, but it left a mark. Naruto exhaled softly, retreating back into himself as the room moved on around him, unchanged, unaware. Nothing here questioned its own being. Nothing here needed to because nobody knew anything else. Naruto's eyes followed the bucket as it was carried back inside, the same movement repeating itself without end. The thought returned, clearer this time, not a memory, but something his own mind was beginning to form. But that was not the only way, and the idea stayed. It hadn't disappeared like the others had before. It remained, calm and quiet, settling into place as something that belonged to him now, not just to whatever life he had lived before. Naruto looked down, fingers splaying weakly into the floor as the pieces of memory continued to swirl just below the surface of his mind. They were still incomplete, still scattered, but they were not lost anymore. They were coming back, and with them, something else was beginning to take shape. XXXXXXXXX the memories kept coming back, forming a full picture of things that once had been. He did not feel them slipping in or fading out as he had before. There was no struggle to hold them, no effort to make sense of what was to come. He was sitting in the orphanage as he always sat, watching the same quiet movement of the room, and then, one moment to the next, it was simply clear. He remembered who he was. The orphanage then, not this one but familiar in all the right ways. The years that follow, the slow construction of a life without a teacher, learning by doing, not being given, but being able to see how it could be improved. The work he had chosen, how he had seen the world, not accepting it as fixed, but as something that could be reshaped. And the still and last, the quiet room. Naruto pressed lightly on the floor with his fingers, grounding himself as the weight settled without resistance. It did not overpower him, it didn't break him, it just worked. That was his life. Here's the next one. The two did not run in tandem. They were all his, unconflicted, they stayed apart, yet linked. Naruto's eyes grew wide. The orphanage was the same. Same room, same voices, same quiet rhythm that pulsed without stopping. Nothing about him was any different. Him, only. The confusion that had once enveloped everything was gone, replaced by something steady and clear. He no longer looked for meaning in fragments, or tried to hold on to thoughts that floated away. He knew what he had seen, what he had remembered, and what it meant. This world wasn't the one he had come from. It didn't work quite the same way. More importantly, it knew nothing else. The thought settled quietly, no frustration, no urgency, only certainty. The things he had noticed before, the repeated effort, the way everything was done by hand, the absence of things he knew could be, all made sense now. He had not imagined such a thing. Something was missing from this world. Naruto let out a slow breath, his posture still, his presence unseen as the room spun around him. Memories of his past life did not pull him away from where he was. They grounded him, gave form to the uncertain. For the first time since waking into this life, there was no more confusion. He knew who he'd known where he was. And he knew the difference. XXXXXXXX, flashback ends. Earlier the resistance had given way under his hands, the rough motion had smoothed just enough for the mechanism to work again, and the sound of water following had been enough to tell him he had been right. He had not lingered long to watch it. The others had taken over without much thought, the caretaker stepping in and using it as if it had always worked that way, and Naruto had simply stepped back and left, unnoticed in the same quiet way he had always existed among them. Now he sat inside again, in the same place he'd spent so much of his time, the familiar room settling around him, without change. They were the same sounds as before, children moving, voices rising and falling, the steady rhythm of a place that continued without pause, but his attention was no longer on any of it. His eyes were still on the floor, his thoughts still on what had just happened, not the act, but what it meant. He had not guessed that. He had known. He'd seen it the moment he saw it, the way the handle had resisted, the uneven movement, the force applied in the wrong direction before. Not because he learned it here, not because someone taught him, but because he understood it. Because he had remembered. Naruto's fingers lay lightly against the floor, unmoving, as the last of the uncertainty all vanished. The orphanage, the life before this one, the work he had done, the way he had seen things different from other people, all of it now existed together without conflict. He didn't have to reach for it, remembered it wholeheartedly. The room around him did not change and the people in it did not change. No one looked at him any differently, no one acknowledged what had happened outside, and the same quiet distance remained as it always had. And the world went on as if nothing had happened. Naruto glanced up slightly, not at anyone in particular, but at the space in front of him, his thoughts steady in a way they had never been before. The things he had noticed, the effort, the repetition, the absence of what he knew could exist, it all meant something now, not as something strange, but as something incomplete. The realization came quietly, firm and unmoving. For the first time since waking into this life there was nothing to question. And he looked down again, calm, sure, unchanged on the surface, but under that, everything had changed. This world didn't know what it was missing, but he did. The pump began to work again, but the caretaker did not immediately come to him. Life in the orphanage did not stop for small changes, and if something worked, it was seldom doubted. But Naruto had seen the change in the man's behavior over the next few days, little things that no one else would have noticed. The first time the caretaker used the pump more slowly, testing the handle as though expecting it to catch again, his grip tightening slightly when it moved smoother than before. He said nothing then, but he did not forget. Naruto had expected as much. He was sitting in his usual place, near the wall, relaxed and outwardly unfocused in attention, just another part of the quiet rhythm of the room. The children moved around him in small bursts of noise and motion, the matrons passing through with the same practiced efficiency, Nothing in the space indicating that anything had changed. But only Naruto knew that something had. The footsteps came to him before the voice. They were steady, deliberate, not hurried, not hesitant either. Naruto didn't look up right away, but even before the man stopped in front of him he knew who it was. The caretaker stood there for a moment, arms loosely crossed, a faint tension under the usual neutrality of his expression, as if considering how to begin. At length he spoke, and he spoke plainly. "You did the pump work before, didn't you?" Naruto looked up with a steady gaze, his eyes meeting the man's. There was no point denying it, and more important, no reason to. "Yes," he said simply, his tone steady, without defensiveness, without pride. The caretaker studied him closely, as if waiting for something more, some excuse, some childish explanation to make it all go away. When nothing happened the man shifted a little, his brows drawing down just enough to show this was not the answer he had been expecting. "You fixed it," he said, though the way he said it suggested he didn't really believe it. Naruto rolled the word around in his head for a beat before answering, his gaze dropping slightly as if he were reviewing the mechanics in his mind instead of the conversation. "It works now," he said, "but it's not fixed. It still fights where it shouldn't." That got a different reaction out of the caretaker, a subtle change of expression that was enough to indicate Naruto had taken the conversation somewhere unexpected. "What do you mean it's not fixed?" His voice now held more focus, less dismissal. "It's working better than it has in months. That's fixed enough." Once, Naruto shook his head, a careful, controlled motion. "It works because the pieces aren't stuck anymore. But the force isn't flowing right. You're exerting more than necessary." The caretaker let out a sharp, kind of scoffing, quiet laugh, but not a laugh of any real amusement. "Wait, are you saying we've been doing it wrong?" Naruto didn't answer right away. It wasn't that he hesitated, it was just that the answer didn't need to be rushed. His thoughts moved first, back to the feel of the handle, the uneven pressure, the way the motion broke rather than flowed. It wasn't hard. It was just inefficient. "It's not wrong," Naruto said after a moment, "but it's not right either." That answer took the caretaker longer than expected. The man shifted a little, looking toward the doorway as if the pump itself would explain something, if he looked at it long enough. When he looked back, his expression had changed again, not softened but more attentive. "And you knew all that just by looking at it?" he asked, still skeptical, but not entirely. Naruto looked up again. "I didn't just look," he said softly. "I did use it." The caretaker's eyes narrowed a fraction. "And that's enough for you to say it's wrong?" Naruto ignored the tone. "You can feel it as you move the handle," he said, his voice steady, almost matter-of-fact. "It's not even a resistance. It resists where it shouldn't. That means the force isn't going through it correctly." The caretaker looked at him for a moment, longer this time, as if assessing the words by some other thing, something unsaid. There was doubt there, but it had moved into something else too. Curiosity. Restrained, but there. "You talk like you've done this before," the man said slowly. Naruto's eyes went down a bit, not from evasion, but from choosing his answer. "No," he said. "I just know how it moves." The answer was not satisfying to the caretaker, but it did not give him anything to push against. The man exhaled softly, his hand tracing his jaw, and he looked away for a moment, thinking. When he glanced back his expression had settled into a more measured one. "And exactly what are you suggesting we do about it?" he asked. "If it is not right, what would make it right?" Naruto thought the same thing right away. The problem was not the pump, it was leverage. Too short. Handle. The force applied by the user was not being efficiently distributed, and more effort was required to output the same amount. If you extended the handle you would increase the mechanical advantage and so you would need less force to move the same volume of water. Easy. Naruto glanced toward the doorway, his eyes briefly tracing the path of the pump before returning to the caretaker. "The handle's too short," he said. "If you make it longer it's easier to use." The caretaker blinked once. He was surprised at the simplicity of the answer. "That's all?" he asked. "Lengthen it?" "Yeah," Naruto nodded. "You are using too much force because the leverage is wrong. A longer handle spreads the force. The movement is smoother." The caretaker frowned slightly, evidently trying to work out this idea in practical terms rather than in the abstract. "And you're sure about this?" he asked, but the question now was not dismissive, only careful. Naruto was not one to hesitate. "Yeah." The man looked at him again, that old wary look returning for a moment, not at the idea but at Naruto himself. It sat there, unsaid but there, the same hesitation that had always been around him, the quiet reminder of what he carried that others did not understand. You're a strange kid, the caretaker muttered, nearly under his breath, and straightened a little. Okay, he said after a pause, more firmly. Come on then. Show me what you mean. Naruto stood without hesitation, following the man outside. His movements small, but steady. It was cooler air, more open space, but as they approached the pump, his mind was already there. It was where it always had been, used and useful, not changed except for the smoother motion he had restored. The caretaker nodded to it. Go on, he said. I'll have a look at what's wrong with it. Naruto stepped forward and put his hands on the handle and turned it slightly, enough to feel the resistance again, to confirm what he already knew. Improved but still inconsistent, still demanding more effort than needed. The force is wrong here, Naruto said, adjusting his grip a little to demonstrate. You're pushing but it's not going over right. The caretaker leaned forward, watching the movement more closely now. I've been using this thing for years, he said. Feels the same to me. Naruto adjusted the angle a little, altering the pressure. The motion altered, just enough to see. It's easier this way, Naruto said, but it shouldn't make any difference how you hold it. It ought to get easier all the time. The caretaker tried it himself, mimicking the same motion Naruto had just made. His expression changed a little, the change slight but real. Huh, he grunted. Naruto took a step back to look at the piece of wood that was leaning against the wall nearby. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. He pointed at it. That's available. The caretaker looked where he was looking. For what? Replace the handle, said Naruto, his voice even. Attach it here, he said, indicating the direction from which the lever was coming. Make it longer. The man looked from the wood to the pump, and back at Naruto. His skepticism wasn't gone, but it was no longer in control, and that's going to do it. It'll make it better, Naruto said, less force. The caretaker exhaled slowly, still doubtful, but no longer dismissive. What if it breaks? Naruto looked at him calmly. Then I'll fix it again. That was the answer. The man looked at him a moment longer, then shook his head a little, half in disbelief, half in reluctant acceptance. Well, he said finally, let's do it your way. Naruto stepped forward again, his attention tightening on the mechanism, not as something new, but as something he now fully understood, not just by observation, but through memory, from a life where these things had not had to be guessed at. It was easy, and for the first time in coming into this world. He was not guessing anymore. The wood wasn't ideal, but it was usable. He turned it once in his hands, feeling the weight, the balance, the slight unevenness along one side. It would have required a little adjustment, not much, just enough to see properly where the old handle had been. The caretaker studied him for a moment, before speaking again, his tone still edged with that same caution, but now with less dismissal. You aren't going to really tie that on top of the old one, are you? He said, looking at the piece of wood with obvious skepticism. That'll only make it worse. Naruto shook his head once. No, it supersedes it. And that gave the man pause. Put it back, he said once more, looking at the handle in place. You think that thing just falls off? Naruto stepped forward towards the pump, already focusing on the joint where the handle met the pivot. The wear around it told him all he needed to know. It had been removed, or at least changed. The fixing was simple, not permanent. Naruto said, it can. He watched him for another moment, then squatted down beside the mechanism and ran his fingers along the joint as if to confirm what Naruto already saw. Huh, he said it quietly, hadn't thought of that. Naruto didn't answer. His attention had narrowed, not to the conversation, but to the structure itself. The handle was too short and extra effort had to be put into each motion. If you replace it with a longer one, the leverage point will be different and it will take less force. This does not change the internal mechanism. Easy. If it was properly aligned. Steady, said Naruto, putting his hands near the joint. The caretaker looked at him, then at the pump, hesitating only briefly before placing his own hands against the frame to stabilize it. If this breaks, we're both explaining it, he said. It won't, Naruto said, calmly. The old fastening came loose with a slight effort, the worn pin shifting after a few careful movements. Naruto pulled the handle, gently, rather than wrenching it free. The piece came apart in his hands, lighter than he thought it would be, worn smooth by years of use. He handed it to the caretaker. The caretaker turned it once. It made sense, it felt wrong. He said to himself almost, too short, this thing. Naruto was already gone. He aligned the new piece with the pivot, rotated the angle slightly and attempted to place it. It wasn't perfect at first. The edge caught, the alignment just a little off. Overly tight. He moved it again. There, improved. Wait, said the caretaker, leaning in. That won't stay like that. You need something to hold it. Naruto nodded at the ancient pin remaining in the man's palm. That. The caretaker blinked, then looked at it, then back at the new handle. Do you think it'll take? It doesn't have to fit perfectly, Naruto said. It just needs to hold the pivot. The guy hesitated, then moved to help, guiding the pin into place as Naruto adjusted the alignment. It took a little push, not forcing, but firm enough to seat it right. The wood put up a fight at first, then gave just enough for the pin to slide through. It was erect. The caretaker tried it at once, moving the handle a little way. That's actually pretty good, he said, surprise seeping into his voice despite himself. Naruto took a half step back, watching the connection, not just for stability, but for motion. The pivot had to come around clean. If it caught, the whole thing would be for nothing. Try it, urged Naruto. The caretaker stood, putting both his hands on the new handle, changing his grip instinctively. Immediately it felt different, not just lengthwise, but balance-wise. He tugged. The movement changed. Where resistance had once been swift and uneven, it now opened out, the force flowing more smoothly through the motion. It didn't eliminate the resistance, but it brought it down enough that the effort felt significantly lighter. The caretaker halted mid-action, his face changing as he pushed again, more deliberately this time. That's easier, he said, more to himself than to Naruto. He went on, pumping a few more times, and each movement gave the same result. Less stress. More control. The motion no longer broke halfway through, it carried. Then water. Not quicker, but more stable. The caretaker let out a soft breath, slowly releasing the handle and looking at it, then at Naruto, then back again, as if expecting something else to appear. He said, "You didn't touch inside." Naruto shook his head, "It didn't need that." The man looked at the pump for a moment longer, then laughed a short, almost disbelieving laugh. "You're telling me all this time," he trailed off, shaking his head again. "Just needed a longer handle." Naruto didn't argue with him. It wasn't all it needed to be, but it was enough. "For now," Naruto said. The caretaker looked at him, the same expression flitting across his face, briefly, one that held caution and something else, something closer to respect now, even if still guarded. "You haven't finished it, have you?" he asked. Naruto looked back at the mechanism. But there was still the internal resistance. "The alignment isn't so great. The motion might be smoother." "Yes," he said gently. "But this is enough." The caretaker stared at him a moment longer, then gave a single, slow and thoughtful nod. "Yeah," he said. "That's good for now." He drew back from the pump, and his stance was different, not relaxed entirely, but not dismissive any longer. Naruto remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the mechanism, his thoughts moving quietly, not rushing forward, but not stopping either. There were other things that could be done, later. It worked better for now. The pump was routine now. That was the first thing Naruto noticed in the following days. What had called forth small pauses and uncertain glances now went by without thought, the movement of the handle merging with the rhythm of daily work as if it had always been so. Now no one stopped to test it or ask questions. They just used it and that was all right. That morning Naruto stood a short distance away, watching the motion rather than the people around it. The caretaker had told Naruto his name. Daichu had taken his usual position by the pump, one hand wrapped around the extended handle, the other hand bracing lightly against the frame as he pulled it down in a slow, steady motion. Now the movement was more even, the resistance of the catch was distributed, and not sudden, and the effort didn't show in the tension of his shoulders. Daichi made the motion again, more slowly this time, as if gauging it against memory. "Still holding," he said after a moment, his voice low but clear, more an observation than a statement. Again he pulled, feeling it deliberately, then he let go of the handle and stood back, wiping his hands on his clothes. Naruto watched him, unmoving. After a moment, Daichi glanced over, his eyes settling on Naruto with a look that no longer held the same dismissal it once had, though the distance had not disappeared entirely. "You've been watching it?" he said. Naruto nodded. "It is not better," Daichi grunted. Half acknowledgement, half habit. "Feels different," he said, turning a little back toward the pump. "It doesn't fight you halfway through anymore. You can actually keep the motion going without forcing it." Naruto's eyes went to the pivot point, his thoughts already ahead of the conversation, tracing the movement, the small inconsistencies that still lingered under the improvement. "It still catches," he said, stating his observation, close to the top of the movement. Daichi frowned slightly, and reached for the handle again, pulling it more slowly this time, paying attention in a way he hadn't before. There was a faint resistance, easily overlooked, but it was there. A small break in the current that only became apparent when you were looking for it. Yeah, he conceded after a moment, letting go of the handle. Didn't notice that before. Naruto did not answer immediately. He knew that wasn't the point. It was obvious to him. It can be cut down, he said after a moment. The parts inside aren't lined up right. There is still friction where there shouldn't be. Daichi exhaled sharply, shook his head, and took a step back. You say that like we can just fix it, he said, looking back down at the pump. That'd have to be disassembled whole. Naruto pondered for a moment. Yes. The answer was quick and easy. Daichi looked at him again, a faint expression of incredulity crossing his face, and then he let out a quiet laugh that had no real humor in it. Of course, he muttered. You fix one part and then you decide the rest isn't good enough either. Naruto didn't protest. It can work better, he said. Daichi looked at him for a moment, this time longer, his gaze narrowing slightly as though trying to place something that didn't fit easily. There was still that undercurrent of wariness there, that unspoken tension that had nothing to do with the pump itself, but it no longer drowned out everything else. You don't let things be, do you? He said. Naruto's eyes dropped a little, not in avoidance, but in quiet recognition. No. The simplicity of the answer remained. Daichi turned back towards the pump, his hand finding the handle again and tugging again, as if testing the weight of that response along with the movement itself. The improvement was obvious. The effort was not so much. The motion was more fluid. Whatever Naruto had done, it worked. It's good enough, Daichi said after a moment, letting go of the handle and standing straight. There's no point in breaking something that's working just to make it a little better. Naruto nodded in agreement. That was true for the moment. Daichi stepped away from the pump and wiped his hands as if to indicate that the job was done, but he didn't leave right away. He paused, the change in his stance was slight. Then he turned back to Naruto, the expression on his face less free than before. If you're going to keep doing this, he said, his tone firm but not dismissive anymore, then you come to me first. I'm not having you pulling things apart on your own and leaving me to deal with it if something goes wrong. Naruto looked up at him, meeting his gaze. Daichi went on, folding his arms loosely across his chest. I'll give you this, you've got a good eye. But don't start fixing everything you see just because you can. This place runs on what works, not what might work better if we had the time and tools we don't. Naruto listened, not interrupting. If something goes wrong with what you do, Daichi added, it comes back on me. So if you want to change something, you tell me first. You understand that? Yeah, said Naruto. Daichi held his gaze a moment longer, as though considering that answer, then nodded once. All right, he said. And if you need something, tools, materials, whatever it is you ask. Don't go taking things without asking. If it's within reason, I'll see what can be done. The words drifted between them. They weren't nice, they were not soft, but they brought something else. Naruto knew it. I will, he said. Daichi looked at him for another moment then nodded slightly, more to himself than Naruto, and turned to walk back to the main building, his steps steady, not carrying the same edge as they once had. Naruto remained where he was, his eyes returning to the pump. It was an improvement. Not enough, not yet. XXXXXXXX time did not run in clear lines in the orphanage, but it ran all the same, not marked by days but the slow change of the world outside. The dry heat of summer hung on for a time, pressing on the walls, seeping into the wood and stone until all felt still and heavy. The air carried dust more than movement, and even the children, restless as they were, moved less in the afternoons, their energy dulled by the weight of it. The first change came with the wind, soft at first, then cool, bringing something different with it, something that didn't belong to the dry heat that had filled the days before. Then the sky shifted. The blue sucked out beneath sheets of gray that gathered slowly, the world itself preparing for something it had done countless times before. When it rained, it poured. It came down in steady sheets, beating on the roof with a rhythm that filled the space more completely than silence ever had. The sound reverberated through the orphanage, continuous and unremitting, filling the summer quiet with motion that never quite stopped. The air grew cooler, the dust settled, and the world outside seemed to breathe again. The children behaved like children always behaved. They ran to it. Naruto stood just inside the overhang of the porch, close enough to the edge so that he was out of the rain, eyes focused on the yard beyond as the others hurried out without a second thought. The ground grew dark with the falling water, small puddles forming quickly under the rain. The children moved through the puddles with careless energy, laughter cutting through the steady sound of the rain as they splashed through water that soaked into their clothes almost immediately. Naruto moved forward a little, just enough for the edge of the rain to reach him. The droplets were cold on his skin, sharper than he expected, but not unpleasant. They had a kind of clarity about them that was clean and immediate and that the dry heat of summer had lacked completely. He stood there a moment, not moving forward, not moving back, just watching the sensation settle. The children continued playing, their movements loud and irregular, their laughter rising and falling in no particular pattern as they splashed through the ever larger puddles. Some slipped and recovered, others ran around without any direction, acting more on the moment than any thought behind it. Naruto watched, not at a distance, but not joining. The separation continued. The rain continued to fall. Days like that passed, the pattern settling in as naturally as the dry heat had. The earth never quite dried out, the air was always damp and the sky was more often than not overcast. The sound of rain became familiar, sometimes constant, sometimes far away, sometimes it would disappear for a time, only to return without warning. Naruto was used to it. He saw how the structure reacted, where the water collected, how it flowed along the edges of the roof before falling, how the ground moved under repeated impact. He watched the changes in movement, the way the children adapted without thinking, the way the matrons adjusted their routines slightly to account for the weather. And he saw the lamps. They acted differently in this season. The flames that had been fairly steady in the stillness of summer now flickered continually, responding to the delicate changes in air that the rain brought. Even when the wind wasn't strong, it was there, weaving through the structure in ways that were more difficult to predict, disturbing the flames just enough to make their light less reliable. Yet Naruto saw it and did nothing, because most of the time it held. It wasn't until the night. This storm was heavier than the others, the kind that formed quietly and then revealed itself all at once. And then the rain got louder, first the steady rhythm morphing into something louder, something more forceful, hitting the roof in quick succession like it was trying to break through it rather than fall on it. The wind followed shortly after, stronger now, pressing in on the structure in uneven gusts that found their way through every little opening they could. Inside the lamps there was a flickering. Naruto immediately noticed. The flames bent sharply with every shift of air, shrinking and stretching and fighting to retain their shape as the wind was in them again and again. Their light shattered, no longer spreading evenly across the room, but breaking into pieces that left parts of the space dim while other parts stayed unevenly lit. The first of the lamps near the far wall flickered, the flame getting thin and then dying away altogether, and that part of the room was in shadow. Another soon followed, the sudden absence of light altering the space more than the presence of the others could compensate for. The room didn't go dark, but it ceased to be clear. Naruto's eyes flickered over the shifting light, his focus intensifying as he observed the way the remaining flames fought to stabilize, their movement no longer controlled, their output erratic. Not that the lamps had gone out. It was one they could not keep. Thunder rolled through the night, low and rumble, the sound echoing through the structure a moment before the flash that followed, brief and bright, illuminating the room in a way the lamps could not. A child moved. The child looked up, and Naruto turned his head a little, watching the movement with his eyes. The child sat up suddenly, confused by the sudden noise. The light was uneven, and the space was unfamiliar, the shadows reaching in directions that did not match the structure of the room. The child hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to go. He moved anyway. He rose from his bedding, his movements quick but uncertain, his eyes too slow to adjust to the shifting light around him. The other lamps provided enough light to see shapes but not enough to make them out, so that there were gaps in what was seen that the child could not explain. He made his way toward the usual haunts of the matrons. Naruto watched the movement closely, his eyes not on the child himself but on the space between each step, on the way the light failed to support the motion that followed. It was a quiet misstep. A slight shift. A loss of balance, too small to see till it was gone. The fall followed instantly, a sharp sound against the uneven quiet of the room, the impact echoing just long enough to pull every bit of attention to it. Then came the cry, louder than anything else that had filled the space that night. Everything else ceased. Naruto remained still. He glanced. Outside the rain fell, a steady, relentless downpour, the wind pressing against the structure, as it had before, unaffected by what had just occurred within. It wasn't the dark. The light had, or rather, how it failed. The morning was quieter than the night before. The storm had passed, the air was damp and the ground soft, the steady rhythm of rain punctuated by the occasional drip of water falling from the edges of the roof. That day the orphanage went slower, the usual routines carried on, but with a subdued weight that laid beneath them. The child that fell the night before had been treated, his arm wrapped and secured, his movement limited but stable. The matrons were more watchful than usual, more than before their attention flitted. All of it, Naruto saw, the worry, the voices and the cause. The lights had gone out. He stood near the edge of the main room for a moment, glancing quickly at the area where the fall had occurred, not at the child so much as at the space itself. The distance. The light. The spaces between the seen and unseen. Then he spun around. Daichi was out. Naruto found him in the storage area, sorting through supplies moved during the storm, his motions steady, practical, intent on putting things back to their normal order. Naruto came over and he didn't look up immediately, but he didn't ignore him either. "What?" Daichi asked after a moment, still concentrating on the task ahead of him. Naruto did not answer right away. His thoughts fell into place first, not hurried, not unsure, but in a structure that had become familiar to him. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the breeze. It was the answer of light to it. "The lamps went out," said Naruto. Daichi hesitated, then went back to work, but more slowly. "They went out," he said. "That can happen when the wind is strong enough." Naruto shook his head. "Not only that. The light went out before they did." Daichi stopped. He turned a bit, looking at Naruto with a slight frown, as if the distinction didn't immediately make sense. "Broke?" he said again. "It's a flame, it doesn't break." Naruto looked right back at him. "It stopped being consistent," he said. "The shadows changed. Even when it was on you couldn't see clearly." Daichi looked at him for a moment, then exhaled softly, shifting his weight and leaning slightly against the wooden frame beside him. "It was a storm," he said. "You're not meant to see clearly in there." Naruto didn't protest. He need not. "It could be better," he said. Daichi sighed briefly, as if with weariness, almost doubt. "You say that a lot," he mumbled. "You look at it long enough and everything can be better." Naruto did not deny it. "And it can be." Daichi watched him a moment longer, then shook his head slightly, as if putting something aside. "Okay," he said. "What are you thinking now?" Naruto's eyes then moved to the lamp on a surface nearby, relit that morning. Now the flame burned steadily, small and controlled, unruffled by the calm air. "It's not the fire that's the problem," Naruto said. "It's because it's out in the open." Daichi looked. "It's exposed, of course," he said. "It needs oxygen." Naruto nodded. "Yes. But it is too much." Daichi frowned somewhat. "You can't control that. It's wind." Naruto picked up a piece of paper lying nearby and a brush and ink that had been left from earlier use. He was not in a hurry. He moved deliberately, his thoughts forming with the lines he began to draw, not detailed, not precise, but structured enough to convey the idea. Daichi watched him, expression changing slightly as the drawing took shape. "You're drawing it?" he asked. Naruto didn't raise his head. "It is easier to demonstrate." The lines made a simple structure, a base, a frame, an enclosed space around the flame with gaps left on purpose. Not sealed. Closed. In between somewhere. Naruto turned the paper slightly so Daichi could see. "The flame should be covered," he said, "but not sealed. Air should pass through here," he said, pointing to small openings near the base and top, "so it doesn't go out, but the wind doesn't hit it directly." Daichi moved closer, studying the drawing, his face no longer dismissive but thoughtful. "You mean, put it in something?" he asked. "Yup. And that won't jam it." Naruto shook his head. "Not if the air can get through it. It just won't hit it all at once." A beat of silence passed as Daichi's eyes darted from the drawing to the real lamp sitting nearby. "And in what are you putting it?" he asked. "You can't just put it in anything. It'll catch fire." Naruto's eyes went to a glass jar nearby. "That," he said. Daichi followed his gaze. "A jar?" he said uncertainly. "It blocks wind," said Naruto. "Light still gets through." Daichi took the jar and rotated it in his hands, staring at it as if for the first time in a different light. "It's shut," he said. "Where does the air go?" Naruto pointed to the top. "Come on. It needs to be cut. Open here, and space at the bottom." Daichi sighed. "Can't cut glass," he said. "Not like that." Naruto didn't answer immediately. That was not a limitation, it was a step. "Somebody can," he said. Daichi looked at him. "The glassmaker," he mumbled. Naruto nodded. Daichi glanced at the drawing again, then at the jar, then back at Naruto, his expression no longer dismissive, but cautious in a different way now. "And you're sure this is going to work?" he asked. Naruto took the question as a verification, not as a doubt. It needs to be protected with proper airflow and it will give a steady flame. It would work. It was a lantern, of course. He knew this, it was a tried and true appliance in his old world before the invention of electronic lights. This design should work here too. Yes, he answered. Daichi looked at him for a moment longer, and then exhaled slowly, shoulders shifting as if he'd come to a decision he wasn't quite comfortable with yet. Okay, he said. Let's say we do this. That jar won't last. It'll crack, or break, or someone will knock it over. If we're going to do it, we do it properly. Naruto's eyes narrowed a little. Metal frame, Daichi said aloud now. Something to hold it down. A base to keep it steady. A handle, maybe. Naruto nodded in agreement, and space for the flame. Daichi took another look at him, and whatever it is you talk about with the air. Naruto pointed back to the picture. Openings, controlled. Daichi let out a soft breath and shook his head, somewhere in the realm of disbelief and reluctant acceptance. You never quit, do you? Naruto didn't respond. He didn't have to. Daichi put the jar back beside the lamp, staring at the flame for a second before he spoke again, his voice softer this time, less dismissive than before. Some of these burn differently. He gestured toward the lamp. You probably noticed that already. Naruto's eyes stayed on the flame. Yes, he replied. The movement is more steady. It doesn't move as much. Daichi nodded slowly. That's the thing. He added, not all of them are created equal. Some last longer, some burn cleaner, some just hold better. No matter how much oil you put in them, they don't behave the same way. Naruto took a small step forward, his attention on the flame. He was no longer just observing it, but trying to understand what made it different. Why? He said. Daichi let out a harsh breath, scratching the back of his neck as though the question had taken him somewhere strange. If I knew that well, I wouldn't be here doing this, he said. Something the shinobi use. Or something they put into it. I've heard people talk about it, but that's about it. Naruto stared at him. What is it? Daichi faltered. He wasn't trying to evade the question, he just didn't have a good answer. They call it chakra, he said after a moment, the word more repeated than understood. Some kind of energy. Comes from the body, or maybe the mind. I don't know exactly. Shinobi use it for all sorts of things. Fighting, moving fast, doing things that don't make much sense if you look at it too closely. Naruto listened without interrupting, his face unchanged but his attention focused completely on the fight. Energy, he said again, not as a question but as something he was trying to place. Daichi nodded, but with doubt. That's what they say. I've seen lamps like this, ones that don't flicker so much. They say it's chakra, something mixed into the way it's made. Makes it more stable. Other than that, I wouldn't know. Naruto looked back at the fire. It was the same structure, used the same, it behaved differently. Means the difference wasn't external, it was something internal. What's a shinobi? Asked Naruto. Daichi glanced at him again, a slight furrow between his brows, as if he'd been expecting the question, but not quite so directly. You haven't seen them? He inquired. Naruto shook his head. Daichi sighed and looked quickly to the village beyond the orphanage, then back. They're the ones that deal with stuff outside what people like us deal with, he said. Protection, missions, whatever the village needs that isn't just work and trade. They train for it. Use that chakra I mentioned. Do things most people can't. Naruto quietly took that in. May I see them? He said. Daichi looked him over for a moment and then let out a small breath and shifted his posture, as if thinking about something he hadn't yet planned on agreeing to. If we're going to do this, I'll have to go to the blacksmith and the glassmaker, he said. Come along with us. You'll see them round the village. No guarantee you'll understand what they're doing, but you'll see enough. Naruto nodded once. That was enough for the present. Daichi shook his head briefly, almost in resignation. Don't go away, he added. You stick with me and you don't get in anybody's way. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Got it, said Naruto. Daichi looked at him a moment longer, then nodded, as if settling the issue. We'll go later, he said. Once things are settled down here. Naruto looked at the lamp again. The flame was steady and unchanged. But no longer easy. Energy, chakra. The word plagued him. Not fully understood but related, not strange either. There was something about it, familiar. As if he'd seen something like this before. Something that worked without being noticed. Naruto didn't follow it. Instead he stared at the flame. And this time, he was not simply staring at the light. XXXXXXX. The orphanage had not changed much in a single night, but something about the morning felt different to Naruto. It was not in the structure or in the routines that followed, but in the way attention was given to things a fraction longer than before. The child, injured, stayed inside, his arm bound and held still, the matrons fussing over him with more care than usual. They had relit the lamps as they always did, and the flames were steady now without the wind, the failure of the flame earlier already fading into something that would be accepted rather than questioned. Daichi called out to Naruto, who was standing near the entrance, the man already ready to leave, a small cloth bag slung over his shoulder with what little they needed for the day. His pose was as practical and focused as always, but there was a difference in the way he looked at Naruto now, not as an afterthought, but as someone who was expected to follow. "Stay close," Daichi said as they stepped out. "We're not dragging this out any longer than it needs to be." Naruto nodded once and followed him. The world outside the orphanage immediately felt larger, not because it was farther away, but because it was in motion. The village was not quiet like the orphanage often was. It bore sound in layers. Footsteps, voices, the distant rhythm of work being done, the occasional call from one place to another. The rain had softened the ground and shallow puddles and damp earth lay along the paths and the air still held the lingering coolness of the storm. Naruto's eyes roamed, not in distraction but in observation. They had been built differently from the orphanage, more varied, some with stone reinforcement, some with wood, all designed with a purpose, not the repetition of the construction. Tools sat outside some shops, materials piled in a way that spoke of work in progress, not storage. People went through the space with purpose, not drifting but going somewhere, doing something. And they saw him. Not all of them, not too overtly, but enough. A look a second too long. A conversation that waned a little as he passed. A change in posture that created space without being obvious about it. Naruto saw it, he did nothing. Daichi didn't acknowledge it either, his pace steady, his eyes forward as he led the way through the streets. If he saw it, he didn't show it, and Naruto knew that this too was simply the way things were. First they came to the smith. They didn't even have to step in before the clang of metal against metal echoed through the open structure. Rhythmic and steady, each hit was made with precision rather than power. Here the air was warm, laden with the scent of hot metal and ash. The forge burned steadily at one end, the smith working at the center, movements deliberate, each action following the last without pause. Daichi came up and he looked up, his face blank but watchful. "What do you want?" he asked, setting his hammer down but not walking away from his work altogether. Daichi gestured to Naruto for a moment before speaking. "We need to make a frame," he said. "For a lamp. Something to hold a glass enclosure, keep it steady and protect it." The blacksmith's eyes flicked to Naruto, stayed there for a second, and snapped back to Daichi. "A lamp frame?" he said. "You have them?" "Not like this," Daichi said, reaching into his bag, pulling out the paper Naruto had drawn on earlier. He passed it over without further explanation. The blacksmith took it, his eyes passing over the rough design, and his mood changed just a little as he took it in. "This is not standard," he said, after a moment. "You're wrapping it more than normal." "It has to be able to withstand the wind," Daichi replied. "Don't just sit there." The smith looked at Naruto again. He asked, "Your son's idea? This kid's idea?" This time Daichi didn't hesitate. "No, he's from the orphanage I work at, Naruto. He came up with the design." The man stared at Naruto for a moment longer, then looked back to the drawing. "It will require proper airflow," he said. "You shut it too tight, the flame goes out." Naruto moved forward a little. "Openings at the bottom and close to the top," he said, indicating the sketch. "Not direct exposure, controlled." That made the blacksmith's eyebrows go up a fraction, his attention sharpening. "You've thought this through," he said. Naruto said nothing. The man let out a slow breath and nodded once. "All right," he said. "Metal frame, stable base, supports for the glass. I can make that. Won't take long." Daichi nodded. "We'll be back for it." They didn't stick around. The glassmaker's shop was quieter, the work less forceful but no less precise. Shelves lined the walls, displaying various pieces of glasswork, some functional, others more decorative. The man behind the counter looked up as they came in, mild but curious. Daichi put the jar on the surface. "We need this cut," he said. "Edge clean, topped off." He picked it up, turning it in his hands, examining it with practiced ease. "And why would you want that?" he asked. Naruto moved forward. "To contain a flame," he said. "Let light, block wind." The man's eyes went to him, the mild curiosity giving way to interest. "You're making a closed flame," he said. "Yeah, what's it called, kid?" said Daichi. "A lantern." Naruto said. The glassmaker smiled slightly. That's one way of doing it, he said. I'll cut it. You'll want the edges smooth, or you'll have more problems than you started with. Daichi nodded his head. Do it. No time was lost. Naruto watched closely, concentrating on the process, on the scoring of the glass, on the careful application of pressure, on the clean and precise separation. This wasn't random. It wasn't force, it was method and skill. Soon after they stepped back outside, the modified glass carefully wrapped and placed into Daichi's bag. They took a different route back through the village, one Naruto hadn't seen before. It was there that something changed. The movement started first. Too quick. Not in a way that blurred all the way out, but in a way that didn't match the effort that was required. A figure moved across the space above, not jumping like a normal person but going from one rooftop to another with a control that did not conform to the distance. Naruto's eyes followed it immediately, then another, then a third. Daichi continued to walk. Don't stare, he said softly. Naruto said nothing but his attention was on the movement, on the way they landed silently, on the way their motion was carried without breaking. That's shinobi, Daichi added after a moment, his voice low but matter of fact. That's what I was talking about. Naruto saw one of them stop for a second on a rooftop and then vanish from sight in a way that normal movement did not allow. Not concealed. Gone, his mind latched onto that. The distance, the speed, the lack of impact. It didn't match. It was familiar. A vague feeling came to mind. Not clear, not complete, but enough to create a feeling of recognition without context. Something about movement that wasn't about being in constant motion. Something that flew over the space in between. The idea faded away before it could take shape. Naruto didn't pursue him. His mind came back to the here and now. They went on walking. When they returned, the metal frame was ready. Not for display. It wasn't graceful. It was built for purpose. The structure was solid, the base stable, the supports exactly where they needed to be. The blacksmith passed it over without ceremony, his eyes flicking briefly to Naruto, then back to Daichi. Matches your design, he said. Don't burn the place down with it. Daichi gave a slight nod. We won't, she said. The assembly started again at the orphanage. Naruto worked with Daichi, not directing, but adjusting, his hands steady as he placed the glass into the frame, making sure the spacing was even. The openings were kept as designed, small to control air, large enough to keep the flame going. The lamp was alight. The flame held on. They waited. A small breeze moved through the space, weaker than the storm, but enough to test the structure. The flame moved, but it didn't burn out. Daichi leaned in, watching it carefully, then let out a slow breath, his posture easing just a little. It holds, he said. I told you it would work, said Naruto. It was not a new design for him, but it was for this world. He smiled. It was his first working design in this world after all. The orphanage was not transformed in a single night. The days were the same on the surface, the same routines, the same work, the same voices moving through the halls. But little things began to feel different with time. The nights were steadier now, the light holding where it had failed before, and the space moved more easily around it. What started as a change did not stand out by itself anymore. That was the way it was now. The lantern was no longer a thing. It had begun as one, created by effort and uncertainty, tested against wind and doubt, but it had not been alone for long. It was something to be repeated once it had shown itself to be useful, once it had survived the kind of instability which had once made trouble. Daichi had not said much when they built the first, but he had not stopped there. Wherever possible materials were gathered, metal reshaped at the smith, glass cut and fitted more accurately each time, and slowly, without fanfare, more lanterns began to appear. They were not identical, some rougher than others, their frames less refined, their glass slightly uneven, but they all followed the same structure. Flame enclose. Controlled ventilation. Steady output. They didn't flicker the way the old lamps had, and more importantly, they didn't fail at the first sign of wind. The nights changed. Where shadows had broken the space into uncertain fragments, now the light held more consistently, stretching across the room without collapsing at its edges. Movement was simpler, not faster, but more assured, the path from one place to another no longer interrupted by unexpected absence of visibility. The matrons adapted without admitting it, placing the lanterns where they mattered, near the sleeping areas, near the stairs, near the entrances where movement was most likely to turn uncertain. The children adjusted even more quickly. They no longer hesitated when they walked at night. They did not wake to confusion so often, their surroundings clearer even when the weather changed. The fear that had once come with sudden darkness faded into something less immediate, replaced by a familiarity that settled quickly into routine. The thing was not repeated. Naruto watched it all, not drawing attention to himself, his presence as it always had been, a little to the side, not excluded, but not included. That hadn't changed. What had changed was the way his actions were left. They did not vanish into routine immediately, they stayed around. Daichi noticed. He did not say it openly, but his behavior changed in ways that Naruto recognized better than anyone else would have. Now when he spoke he did not dismiss him outright, nor did he consider his remarks as something to be brushed aside. He didn't encourage him either, not directly, but there were moments now where he stopped, where he looked, where he thought before he answered. That was all. One evening, lanterns were being lit, and Daichi was standing near the central one, fiddling with the wick, then stepping back. Naruto was already there, staring at the flame, watching it settle into its steady rhythm, the light spreading outwards in a way that did not collapse under minor shifts in air. Daichi glanced at him without turning his head. "You see anything wrong with it?" he asked, his tone casual but not dismissive. Naruto's eyes still remained on the lantern. He looked first at the flame, then at the flow of air through the openings, then at the stability of the frame itself. "It holds," he remarked. "The air is coming through evenly." Daichi nodded a little. "Better than the first," he said. "Glass fits tighter, no rattle." Naruto glanced at the base. "It could be more steady," he added. "The bottom isn't balanced 100%. Daichi exhaled briefly, something close to a quiet acknowledgement. "Yeah," he told. "I saw that when I put it down. We'll fix it next time." That was the end of the exchange. The knowledge stayed. Naruto went through the days with the same quiet consistency, but his attention had shifted. He didn't only see what was in front of him anymore. He saw how things were linked, how one change caused another, how systems behaved when they were changed. The pump, the lanterns, the very structure of the orphanage, none of it was a separate piece, but a part of something larger. He started looking for it. Where water was inefficiently used. Where movement caused unnecessary effort. Where structure was too weak for repeated use. He did not act upon everything that he saw. He didn't have to. First, observation. Understanding came. He still focused on the lanterns. Not the structure, but the fire. Some burned more steadily than others, even in the same design. It was a subtle difference, but one that once seen, could not be ignored. The fuel was identical. It was the same structure, and yet the behavior was different. Naruto observed carefully. The way the flame moves, the way the light is steady. How some remained still while others responded more dramatically to slight changes in air. It wasn't random. There was a cause. Daichi gave the only explanation he could, and even then without certainty. "It's something they add to it," he had said once, standing next to Naruto as they looked at the lanterns. "Some sort of energy. Chakra, I think they call it. It's used for all sorts of things by the shinobi. These probably have a little of that in them." Naruto heard it. He hadn't answered immediately. Energy. He didn't fully get it, but it matched what he saw. Some invisible thing. Something that affected behavior but did not change visible structure. It hung on. Not to conclude but to ask. The orphanage changed slowly, not in appearance, but in the way it was used. It became stable. More predictable. The small improvements adding up to something that felt less strained, less reactive. During the night the matrons moved with less urgency. The kids slept better. Daichi was working to a slightly different rhythm. His tasks not quite so often broken up by things that once would have needed immediate attention. XXXXXXX. The announcement was made in the afternoon, when the children were gathered more intentionally than usual. It was not the casual grouping that came with meals or routine instruction, but something more organized, more intentional. The matrons moved with a different kind of focus, positioning the children, making sure they stayed still, their usual tolerance for movement replaced with quiet insistence. Naruto stood amongst them, not in the center, not at the edge, but present enough to see everything clearly. The matron stepped up. She was erect and calm, but there was something underneath her, something that implied importance beyond ordinary. She waited for the room to settle completely, then spoke, her voice low but full enough to command attention without effort. "Listen well," she said. "Someone is coming in here." The words themselves were enough to change the atmosphere. A murmur went through the children, small, contained, but there. The matron did not scream. She didn't have to. "This is no ordinary visit," she went on. "The Hokage will be coming here." The murmurs altered. Confusion. Acknowledgement. Excitement from some. Uncertainty from others. Naruto stood still, The word meant nothing to him, not now. The matron continued, her eyes sweeping over the group, keeping focus where it was required. When he gets here, you stay exactly where you are. Don't say anything unless you're told to. Don't move unless you're told to. Just act the way you're supposed to act. This is important, she said. Not just for this place but for all of you. You will show respect. You will listen. And you will not cause disruption of any kind. The orders had gone in. Clear, firm, inescapable. Naruto listened, without reaction, but his attention shifted slightly, not to the matron, but to the word itself. Hokage. The word had weight to it, not in meaning, but in response. It got a reaction from the children. That was enough to make it matter. Daichi stood off toward the back, standing still, expression neutral, but when Naruto's gaze flicked over to him, he saw the brief shift there as well, the faint nod that said this was no regular occurrence. Naruto stayed standing as the others began to scatter, his gaze fixed on the word that had so easily changed the entire room. He turned a little, and saw Daichi near the back, walked over without a second thought. Daichi saw him come, his stance unchanged, but his eyes turning. What Hokage? Naruto asked. Daichi exhaled a little, as if he had anticipated the question but not necessarily intended to provide a detailed answer. He's the headman of the village, he said. All of this, the people, the work, the shinobi, it all comes under him. Naruto listened, his face blank. Shinobi, he said again. Those we saw in the village. Daichi gave a single nod. Yeah. Them. Trained for things most people don't deal with. Protection, missions, keeping things running outside things civilians can deal with. Naruto's eyes fell a little, his thoughts echoing what little he had seen so far. And they use that energy, he said. Chakra. Daichi shifted his weight, a slight scratch at the side of his neck. That's what it's called, he answered. Don't ask me how it works. I've seen what they can do with it, but that doesn't mean I understand it. It's something they train for, something most people don't have control over. Naruto looked back up at him. Can anyone do it? Daichi stopped for a moment before he responded. Maybe, he said. But not like them. Shinobi train for it from a young age. It's not something you just pick up because you want to. There's a system to it, people who teach it, rules around it. Naruto quietly absorbed that. Daichi looked at the main building and then at Naruto. When the Hokage comes you'll see more of it. He won't come by himself. Shinobi will go with him. Stay where you're supposed to and just watch. That's enough. Naruto nodded one time. That was plenty. The explanation was not complete but it did not need to be. The arrival was not a noisy one, but it was felt before it was seen. The orphanage had been prepared well ahead of time, the children gathered and instructed, the rooms scrubbed cleaner than normal, and the schedules changed to cut out unnecessary movement. The matrons moved with a quiet tension which did not break their composure but changed it just enough to be noticed. The air within the building felt different, not heavier but more deliberate, like everything had been arranged to meet expectation rather than just exist. Naruto stood in the back of the room. No explanation was given for his positioning there, he was nudged into place with the rest, not central not hidden, but far enough away to watch without being noticed. The children stood in rows, their posture uneven despite efforts to correct it, their attention a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Naruto stood still and listened. The sound was the first thing, footsteps coming from outside, steady, measured, and with it the quieter presence of others moving in coordination, not singly. A short while later the door opened and there was an immediate shift in the room, not in sound, but in attention. Hiruzen Sarutobi walked in. He did not carry himself with force or impose presence through volume or motion, but there was something about the way the space responded to him that made his position clear without having to be stated. His eyes moved calmly around the room, not fixing on any one point, but taking in everything at once, his posture relaxed but controlled, his hands resting loosely at his sides. The matron moved forward at once, nodding slightly in deference. Lord Hokage, she said, her voice even, her composure unbroken in spite of the importance of the moment. We are proud of your coming. Hiruzen nodded slightly in acknowledgement. You've kept this place up well, he said, his voice soft, even, with no more than faint praise, no less than cool indifference. I appreciate the effort it takes to keep things running here. Daichi stood a little behind and to the side, less practiced than the matron but no less respectful. He did not answer immediately, letting the exchange settle, then stepped forward slightly. We do what we can, he said. The kids get fed, housed, and taken care of. Hiruzen's eyes flicked to him, evaluating him for a moment but without judgment. And recently improved, I hear, he said. his eyes moving past him into the interior of the orphanage, where the lanterns hung in place, their design noticeably different from the standard lamps used elsewhere. Daichi hesitated a moment before he answered. "A little bit," he said. "Something to deal with the wind in the rains." Hiruzen moved forward, his focus clearer now on a single one of the lanterns, his eyes narrowing a bit as he looked at how that one was built. He didn't touch it immediately. He looked at it, noting the enclosure, the openings for air, the stability of the frame. "This wasn't in the original setup," he said. "No," said Daichi, "it was proposed." Again Hiruzen's gaze moved, this time with more purpose, though he still didn't quite face the children. "Suggested," he said again, as though he were thinking of the word rather than the answer. Daichi didn't say any more. Hiruzen let the moment be. "Practical," he said, hesitating, "and effective, as far as I can see." The matron nodded her head a little. "It's made the nights easier," she said. "Safer." Hiruzen nodded once, then turned and began to walk further into the orphanage, his pace unhurried, his gaze shifting from object to space, from structure to function. He noted the layout of bedding, the distance between movement paths, the location of resources, all without breaking the flow of the room. The children were motionless. Naruto watched. Hiruzen's eyes moved slowly over them, not scanning, but acknowledging each face, each posture, each presence. At first he did not linger on any one child. But when his eyes got to the back, they halted. Naruto's eyes met his. There was no answer on his face. No acknowledgement. Just observation. But in that moment, something shifted. Not in Naruto but in Hiruzen. His face was still, but behind it something was stirring, something that didn't belong to the present, something that reached backwards rather than forwards. The hall faded. He could see that terrible night of the Kyuubi and a small yellow-haired baby sleeping peacefully in his arms. XXXXXXX. The destruction hadn't settled. It hung in the air, in the broken lines of the village, in the silence that fell between voices that should have filled the streets, but didn't. Smoke still rose from places where the fire had been extinguished too late, and the smell of ash had not yet faded into memory. The 9 tails had been sealed, the chaos contained, but nothing of the aftermath felt resolved. Instead it hung there, heavy and unresolved, waiting to be shaped. Hiruzen entered the council chamber with that burden on his shoulders. The room was packed. Not orderly, not calm, full. The shinobi council had gathered quickly enough, but they were not alone. There were civilian representatives too, their voices louder, less disciplined, not by training but by a fear not yet settled into reason. The air was thick with tension, not as a backdrop but as its essence, voices already beginning to rise before the Hokage had even sat down. Sume Inuzuka was at the front, sharp, restless, as if standing still took effort she didn't have to spare. Fugaku Uchiha stood opposite, composed. His expression was unreadable, but his attention was fixed and calculating. Hiyashi Hyuga was stiff and exact, his silence purposeful, not passive. Seated apart, the head of the Kurama clan, his face disturbed, as if something greater than the attack itself had disturbed him. The difference among the civilians was instant. A broad-shouldered man with a strained expression was the first to speak, his voice cutting through the room without waiting for order. "This shouldn't even be a conversation," he said. "That thing's inside a child. You want us to think of it as anything other than a threat? That thing saved this village from being destroyed." Sume snapped back immediately, her tone forceful enough to silence the room momentarily. "Watch your words." It almost wrecked at first. The man shot back, his voice getting louder. "Don't you remember what just happened outside these walls?" Hiruzen moved forward. The room did not quiet down at once, but it changed. "That's enough." His voice was firm, not raised, but had enough weight to pull attention back to where it belonged. He took a seat. Silence fell, not complete, but controlled. Danzo was already on his feet as if he was waiting for the moment. "The 9 tails is sealed," he said, his voice steady, untouched by the emotion filling the room. "The Jinchuriki lives. That alone says where we stand." "Situation." Another civilian voice broke in, sharper, more controlled, but no less heated. A thinner man, dressed more formally, moved forward, his face tight. "You call this a situation? That kid's carrying the same thing that just ripped through our homes. My people are asking me what you intend to do about it, and I don't have an answer for them." "You will have one," Hiruzen replied. "Then give it to me," the man insisted, "because if you don't, that gap will be filled with fear, and you know what that leads to." Then Fugaku spoke, his voice calm, measured, but heavy in its own right. "In this case, fear is not irrational," he said. "The 9 tails isn't gone. It's contained. That's not the same thing. Sume looked over his shoulder. Within a child, she said. You speak of him as if he's already lost. Fugaku didn't bat an eye. I'm talking about what he has, he said. Not this guy. That difference matters, Sume said. That it does, Fugaku agreed, but not to those coming for him. Danzo moved forward a little. We've already seen Kumo step up its border activity, he said. Our scouts have reported movement near known observation points. Iwa has not moved yet, but their silence is not comforting. If the word gets out that the Nine Tails is sealed, within a child, they will not wait. They will either try to take him, or kill him. The words hung heavily. That civilian guy from before stepped up again, his self-control starting to slip. Then why is this even a question? He demanded. Lock him up. Seal him up if you have to. Keep him somewhere no one can get at him. Or kill him. Another voice chimed in quietly, but clearly. The room went silent. Hiruzen's eyes went hard. Repeat that, he said. The man that had spoken stepped forward, his face taut but determined. You heard what I said, he said. If the risk is that high, then you eliminate it, permanently. Chakra shifted and filled the room, not seen but there. Hiruzen rose slowly to his feet. You're talking about a child, he said, his voice no longer calm, the restraint in it thinning under something deeper. A child born into a world that had already decided what he should be. And what he is, shot back the man. Don't minimize it. We all saw what that thing could do. Hiruzen's face hardened. I saw it, he said. I fought it, and I lost people to it. Do not stand here and speak to me about what it is as if I do not understand the cost. The room took a breath. The man did not step back. What's the cost if it happens again? He asked. The question still hung. Danzo took it. It won't happen again, he said, if we take the right precautions. Hiruzen didn't glance at him. And what precautions? He asked. Danzo locked eyes with him. The Jinchuriki is under Anbu control, he said. Raised alone. Taught from birth. Trained to serve the village before he has independent thought. Sume's face went dark at once. You're talking about turning him into a weapon before he can walk, she said. That is what I am proposing, Danzo replied. Fugaku nodded. It's the most secure option, he said. If he's controlled early, the risk is minimized. And what if he's not? Said Danzo. Then you're relying on something you already know is untrustworthy. That's not him, Sume snapped. That was the Nine Tails. And they are one now, said Danzo. The head of the Kurama clan spoke then, his voice softer, but with unease. The mind is not something that can remain untouched under a pressure like this, he said. You're asking a child to live with something that huge. The psychological impact alone is irrelevant if the village falls, Danzo interrupted. It is not irrelevant, the Kurama head replied, his voice tightening. If his mind goes, you lose your control. Then silence. Once more Hiruzen took a step forward. No, he said. The word slicing through all. The room swung to him. He will not be raised as a weapon, Hiruzen continued, his voice steady now, but weighted with something deeper than authority. And he will not be cut off and robbed of all that makes him human before he has a chance to become anything at all. And you'd risk the village for that? Danzo said. Hiruzen locked eyes with him. I would not destroy it from within to save it from without, he said. Shikaku leaned forward a little. Then the alternative is hiding, he said. He must be hidden in plain sight, if he is not weaponized, nor openly protected. In a civilian environment, Inoichi added. Where there is little focus and the patterns are predictable. The civilian man frowned. You would set him in our midst? He asked. After what just happened? That's precisely why, Shikaku said. The less he sticks out the less likely he is to be hit. And what if someone finds out? Asked the man again. Hiruzen stated, then we deal with it. The man advanced suddenly, his composure breaking and something sharper taking its place. No, he said, his voice lifting. We'll deal with it now. His hand stirred. Fast, too fast for a civilian. A drawn blade. Pointing to the door of the room beyond, where the child was being kept. The movement was stopped by force. Between him and the exit, a shadow appeared, and already in place, the blade stopping inches from its path as a hand caught his wrist with precise control. The room was frozen. Hiruzen spoke in a low voice. Enough. The word carried more weight than anything else said so far. The man fought once and then lay still, breathing raggedly, his face a mask of fear and anger. You want us to live with this, he said. To accept it. He said, What I'm asking you to trust is that we won't let what happened last night happen again. That's no answer, the man said. It's the only one you're getting, said Hiruzen. The room had not quite settled after the outburst, but the direction of the discussion had shifted. The voices had quieted to something heavier, more contained, as if the reality of what had almost happened had made everyone see just how near they were to breaking apart entirely. Then Choza Akamichi spoke, his voice breaking the tension not with force, but with steadiness. It carried weight, not because of authority, but because of something deeper rooted. We're all speaking from fear, he said, his large form unmoving, his eyes sweeping over both shinobi and civilian. And we have reason to. What happened last night, no one here will forget it. His eyes fell for a moment before rising again. But that child didn't bring it. He's got it now, yes, but he didn't pick it up. The civilian man who had drawn the blade earlier exhaled a strained breath. That doesn't change who he is now, he said. Choza slowly shook his head. It makes all the difference, said he. Because how we treat him now determines what he will become later. Then silence. Not in accord but in regard. Shikaku glanced at Choza briefly, then back to Hiruzen, the lines of thought in his expression shifting as he recalculated. If we push him too far in one direction, he said, we create the very problem we're trying to avoid. Isolation, fear, resentment, those are not minor risks in this case. And leaving him untrained is another matter entirely, Fugaku added, his tone measured, his stance unchanged. If he's to come into the village he needs to be kept in some way. Not necessarily as a weapon, but not without structure. That can wait, said Soong, her voice sharp now, but no longer out of control. Treat a child with fear and you can expect nothing but the same in return. Danzo's eyes flicked between them, his patience thinning. You are arguing about variables that don't make any difference if the outcome is a failure, he said. Kumo is watching. Iwa is waiting. Both have suffered losses in previous wars. The chance to capture or kill a Jinchuriki will not be missed. This is not hypothetical. Hiruzen moved forward. I know, he said. His voice was different now. Not merely authority but finality. The child will not be weaponized, he continued. He will not be under Anbu control. He shall not be treated as less than human before he has the opportunity to live as one. Danzo's face went hard. And when that decision costs us? He questioned. Hiruzen met his gaze unflinchingly. Then it falls to me, said he. The weight of that answer settled around the room. It didn't take the tension out but it anchored it. Shikaku let out a slow breath. Then we must hide, he said. Civilian orphanage. Little attention. Minimal exposure. Inoichi nodded his head. And tight control of information, he added. If word gets out, everything changes. Hiruzen turned slightly, his eyes now scanning the whole room, not focusing on any one group but addressing them all. Then listen to this, he said. The room quieted. What was closed last night will not be spoken of outside this chamber, he added, his voice firm, there being no room for misunderstanding. The 9 tails is within the child, that much is an S-rank secret. None but those directly responsible for the security of the village are to know. If this information gets out, if even a word of it gets out through uncontrolled channels, it will be considered an act of treason, he said. That word hurt more than anything else that had been said. Treason against the village, Hiruzen continued, at a time where we are already vulnerable, and it will be punished as such. The implication did not require explanation, execution. The room got it. The man who drew the blade earlier looked down, jaw tightening, but he did not speak again. Hiruzen's stare stayed on him for a moment, not in anger now, but in something heavier. Then he turned off. He said, the kid will go to a civilian orphanage. He will grow up not knowing what he carries. He will be protected, but not hidden. And when the time is right, we will decide what to do next. This decision is final. I will not hear any arguments about this. Hiruzen continued, I am the Hokage of Konoha and my word is law. The room was still. Not the heavy silence of the council chamber, fraught with tension and restrained conflict, but something softer, something smaller, contained within walls that had no authority, no pressure, no voices demanding resolution. Just a kid. Naruto lay where he was put, wrapped and still, unaware of the weight that had already settled upon his life, before it had even begun. The world around him had changed, decisions made and lines drawn, futures changed, but none of it reached him here. Hiruzen hesitated at the door and then stepped inside. The air was different here. Easier. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, not out of hesitation but out of something closer to restraint, as if moving too quickly would break something that had yet to form. He halted at the bedside. He said nothing for a long time. He looked down at the child. He was small, still, and the breath came easily, rising and falling, but without the violence that had taken them to this moment. So this was where it had landed. Not a weapon, not a threat, but a kid. Hiruzen exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should. I have decided, he said gently, so gently that his voice hardly stirred the stillness of the room. Was it the right one? I don't know. Instead of going on, his hand rose a little, then paused, hanging just over the edge of the cradle. They talked about you like you were already gone, he said, his eyes softening but the weight in them didn't lift. Like what you carry has already decided who you're going to be. His fingers flexed slightly against wood. I will not take that, he said. Outside the village was slowly recovering. Inside, another decision was being made. You will not be trained as a weapon, Hiruzen said. You will not be locked away and shaped into something you never chose to be. He hesitated and looked down a bit. But I can't give you what you are worth either. The admission hung in the air, heavy and real. I can't keep you near, he said. Not without putting you in more danger than you are now. There are those outside this village who would see you as nothing more than a prize, or a target. He scowled a little. And there are those in it who would consider you a thing to be feared. Silence fell once more. So I will put you somewhere common, he said. Somewhere that doesn't call attention. Somewhere you can grow, without the weight of what you carry being thrust upon you from the beginning. His hand was moving, more solid now against the edge of the bed. He added, it won't be easy, and for that, I am sorry. The words did not come easily, they weren't meant to. He looked at Naruto again, more closely this time, as if to see past what was there, past what had been decided. I'll watch over you, he said, even from afar. It wasn't a grand promise, not absolute but real. And when you're older, he went on, when the time comes, I'll come to you properly. His eyes stayed a moment longer, then quieter. I owe you that. The room was still. Naruto did not move. The world kept moving outside. XXXXXXX. The hall was back. Hiruzen remained where he was. Naruto remained in the back. There had been no change, and yet everyone had. The man entered the hall and Naruto was standing in the back. The change in the room came first of all, not with sound or motion but with attention. The children did not really know what was going on, but they straightened anyway, their small movements driven more by the tension in the adults than by any instruction. The matrons walked differently too, their poise more purposeful, their demeanor more regimented than it had been previously. Naruto watched in silence. The man advanced at a steady gait, neither slow nor hurried, and his presence found an easy place in the space. It wasn't his face that caught Naruto's eye first, but his clothing. It was different from anything else he had seen in this world so far. The outer robe was white, long enough to fall past the knees, and was trimmed with red flames that rose from the hem in a pattern that felt intentional, rather than decorative. The cloth moved lightly with every step, not heavy, not constricting, but held back in a way that suggested it was meant to be seen. Below, darker clothes were pulled closer to the body, less visible but more practical, creating a contrast between form and function. The red hat has a white diamond on the front with red kanji on it. The hat sat low, wide-brimmed, shadowing his face but not enough not to see the expression under it. The symbol on the front meant something Naruto didn't understand yet, but the way everyone reacted to it showed him it held authority beyond the person wearing it. This was not simply a guy, this was a leader. Naruto looked upwards. The man's face was lined, but not weakened, by age. The lines weren't from weakness, but from years of decisions that had left their mark. He was calm, composed, not distant but not open either. His eyes crossed the room, slowly, not in a hurry, not in search, but absorbing everything with a quiet awareness that did not need to make a noise about itself. Naruto felt a change. It was subtle at first. A pressure, slowly building behind his eyes, not painful in the injury sense, but strange, as if something inside him had started to move without his control. His breathing was steady, his body unmoving, but the feeling grew, honed, concentrated to a point that wasn't of now. The man kept walking and Naruto's eyes never left him. The pressure built. It was not coming from outside, but rising from within. His thoughts did not scatter, but something below them began to lift, thrust forward, not as a question, but as something already known, just out of reach until now. The man walked deeper into the hall. Naruto's vision stayed steady. But what he saw had changed. XXXXXXX. The space transformed completely. The hall was gone, replaced by something smaller, enclosed, structured in a way that didn't belong to anything Naruto had seen in this world. The light was artificial, steady and contained, from a single source, that illuminated the space without flicker or distortion. The walls were closed, the objects set out in a practical but alien way, designed by a different kind of designer. Naruto was sitting, not as he was now but in a different form with a different look. Older. Maybe in his teens. But something told him it was him. It was a realization that came without confusion. It settled instantly, as if this point of view had always been somewhere beneath the surface, waiting for the time to return. His eyes were on a head. On a screen. The picture moved with a clarity that didn't belong to the physical world around him. Colors sharper, motion smoother, sound layered in a way that carried weight outside the space it occupied. The voices were not from the people there but from the scene itself, structured, deliberate, telling something rather than happening spontaneously. He was looking, and he knew he had seen it before. The scene was already in progress. In the middle was a barrier, its surface a faint purple glow, enclosing the space within it, separating it from those outside. Figures stood outside, unable to enter, held back by something they could not break through. Within the barrier, two figures faced each other. Naruto's focus immediately intensified. He knew them. Not this life, but before. Hiruzen and Orochimaru. The recognition was instantaneous. The old man was standing. He looked strained and twisted, his body already abused beyond what it should have been, but his posture was still upright. The other sat facing him, cool, in control, with none of the strain that marked his opponent. The worst of the fight was over. Was its end, what was left? He had taken damage, but Hiruzen moved with precision, forming seals with his hands in succession, each movement deliberate, each one adding up to something larger than the action itself. The air moved about him, not visibly, but in a way that carried weight, something gathering, something forming through will rather than force. Orochimaru did not say anything. He looked on, aware and understanding of what was to come. The technique is done. The room shifted. Behind Hiruzen something appeared, an entity massive and unnatural, its presence existing at the edge of perception, both visible and beyond what could be fully understood. And yet it was not part of the physical world. It was in it all the same, and its form was towering, silent, inevitable. Hands passed through the symbol on Hiruzen's belly, not tangible in any usual sense but real in their effect. They coiled around Orochimaru, binding his arms, restricting his movements, not through force, but something deeper, something that denied escape instead of simply preventing it. Orochimaru's face. Fear and recognition. Understanding of the outcomes of the technique. Sensei, his voice drifted, softer now, bereft of its earlier conviction. Hiruzen didn't hesitate. His body was showing the strain, his movements were slower, his breathing heavier, but his resolve did not waver. The ghostly hands tightened, the pull grew, something being torn from Orochimaru, something that fought, that resisted, but couldn't get away. Then with the knife that was in the entity's mouth it sliced off whatever came out of Orochimaru from the rest of his body. The cost became clear. This wasn't an attack. That was a give. Naruto knew. Then came Hiruzen's voice, steady despite everything, not raised, not forced, but carrying the weight of something that had been decided long before this moment. When the tree leaves dance one shall find flames. The words came to rest. Light up the village with the shadow of the fire and again the tree leaves will blossom. The presence behind Hiruzen pressed closer, the certainty of it pressing against the moment as the technique continued to take its toll. The pull didn't relent. It did not waver. Hiruzen's eyes flicked. Not Orochimaru, past him. Naruto stared in the same direction. And saw, not the man that Orochimaru had become, but the child that he had once been, standing in memory, untouched by all that had followed. A smaller figure, looking up, not as an enemy, but as a pupil. When told. Someone who trusted and guided by Hiruzen himself. Hiruzen smiled. Not in triumph. Not in relief but in acceptance with the look of someone who knew the price, and paid it anyway. The moment passed. XXXXXXX. The moment ended without sound, without transition, as if it had never existed anywhere but inside him. The room was back all at once. The orphanage hall swam back into view, the rows of children lined up, the steady presence of the matrons, the muted stillness that had settled over everything since the Hokage had entered. Around him nothing had changed. No one had stirred. The world had continued just as it had been. Naruto didn't break his gaze from the man in front of him, but his focus turned inward, caught on something that didn't quite match up with what he knew. Some parts of the memory were clear, but some were incorrect. He'd seen this man before. That much was certain. But not there. Not this way. Behind the image the space of that memory faintly remained. It had been tiny. Enclosed. The light had been consistent, unnatural. The movement, not real in the same sense. He had not been in it. He had been looking. The thought dawned slowly, then stuck. It watching, not living. Naruto's thoughts clenched on that. This memory did not seem to be like the others. It was too stiff. Too planned. It was not experienced but observed at a distance. What was that? The question lingered. He did not insist on an answer. Not yet, the pieces were wrong. To force it now would only mar the little he had. Instead he let them settle, holding onto the fragments as they were. He'd go back to it, to understand it properly at a later time. Now Naruto's attention was directed entirely to the now before him and the man before him. Nothing had changed around him. The hall was still. The others oblivious. But something inside him had changed enough to understand, just enough to question, and for now, that was enough. Hiruzen didn't head straight to the rear of the hall. He continued on down the line of children at the same steady pace, allowing each contact to be brief but complete. A bit of the tension in the room had relaxed, and in its place was a quieter attentiveness that trailed him as he moved. The children remained in the same place, but their posture had changed. They were not just standing still anymore, they were watching them. He stopped in front of a young girl in the center of the line. She straightened up instantly, her hands tightening a little at her sides. "What is your name?" Hiruzen said. "Ayame," she said, her voice small but strong. "So how have you been, Ayame?" She paused, looking for the right answer. "We have our meals punctually, and go to bed when told. The matrons see to us." Hiruzen nodded, letting the answer settle in before he continued. "And what do you like?" The question surprised her. Her expression shifted, the practiced answer falling away to something more real. After a moment she said, "I like the rain, it is quieter." Hiruzen's eyes grew a little softer. "The village changes in rain," he observed. "It slows. You begin to see things that you might not see otherwise." She nodded. She felt more sure. "Keep on that," he said. "There is value in seeing what others don't." He passed on. Naruto paid attention to the exchange carefully. The words were simple, but they were put there with intent. Hiruzen didn't speak more than he needed to, but every word felt useful. Every exchange was short but complete, shaped as much by how it was answered as by what was asked. He was not just talking to them, he was looking at them, that was clear. Hiruzen went down the line, repeating the pattern, changing slightly with each child, but not making the change obvious. The matrons were quiet now, the previous tension thawing as things continued to be controlled. At last he came to the end. Naruto stood where he had been put, his posture unchanged, his attention steady. Hiruzen came to a stop in front of him. For a moment neither of them said anything. Not the old silence. It was quieter, more deliberate, as though something in the exchange demanded a different tempo. Hiruzen's eyes were on him, not searching, not probing, but holding in a way that was just slightly longer than it had been with the others. Hiruzen said, "Your name?" "Naruto." The name hung for a moment, not in sound but recognition. Hiruzen did not show it, but the pause was there, contained, mastered. "Naruto," he repeated. "How are they treating you here?" Without hesitation Naruto answered. "There's food, water, a place to sleep, it works." That was not the answer he expected. Hiruzen didn't correct. "And then?" Naruto thought for a second. "It can be done better." Hiruzen's eyes moved slightly, but not outward, but inward in focus. "In what sense?" Naruto said, "The light fails with strong wind, like it did during the storm recently. It stops movement at night." Hiruzen listened, but did not reply at once. Instead he watched him, the pause lasting a moment longer than usual, as if he were weighing not just the words but the manner in which they were delivered. "You have a sharp eye," he said. Naruto didn't answer, he didn't find it strange. Hiruzen kept his eyes on him a moment longer before speaking again, softer now but no less forceful. "You've been watching me since I came in." Naruto nodded once more. Hiruzen looked at him for a moment, then said, "If you have something to ask, you may." The offer was resolved. Naruto's thoughts weren't scattered, they moved in sync through what he had already begun to question before choosing what mattered first. "What's a Hokage?" he asked. The question stirred the room, just a little, but enough. It was not the question, but the way the question was asked. Without missing a beat, Hiruzen answered. "The Hokage is the leader of the village," he went on. "Accountable to its people, its protection and the choices that shape its future." Naruto took that in. "And shinobi?" he inquired. "They serve the village with chakra," Hiruzen said. They are trained to do jobs that other people can't do, and they have many roles. Some of them work as soldiers and guards, and some of them work as special forces. They do different jobs for the village. They bring economic benefits and security to the village. Naruto's eyes narrowed a bit. What is the chakra? The question hung on for a moment longer. Before Hiruzen could answer, the matron stepped forward, stiffening her pose. Lord Hokage, she said, respectfully but firmly, the child should not be questioning you in this fashion. Naruto didn't move. Hiruzen glanced at her. It is no problem, he said. It was then Daichi stepped in. Not suddenly, but in the presence enough to be included. He asks questions, he said. That's just him. He notices things. He tries to understand them. The matron hesitated, not knowing whether to press the point. This time more directly, Daichi continued. Those lamps you saw, his idea. He designed them. Same with the pump. He improved it. Hiruzen's attention returned to Naruto, more concentrated now, not in intensity, but in depth. Something more deliberate had come of the earlier observation. You made those changes, he said. Naruto nodded one time. How do you do that? Naruto did not hurry the answer. You could see the problems, he said. The light failed because it was exposed to the environment. It had to be contained without cutting off airflow. The pump needed less force if the leverage was adjusted. He stopped there, no need to explain further, he mused. I don't know if you would understand the complex mechanics behind the machine, as I don't know how developed this world is, he thought. Hiruzen watched him silently for a moment. No confusion in the explanation, no uncertainty, only clarity, given without excess. His face changed, just a little, with restraint, but there. It didn't quite reach the surface, but it remained. Acquainted. Like his father. He thought of Minato with affection. Even as a kid, Minato was known as a genius when he graduated from the academy, he thought. He didn't speak it. Instead he answered the interrupted question. Chakra, Hiruzen said, is a combination of physical and mental energy. It is within the body and is shaped by control. Shinobi are trained to use it. Naruto listened. Can anyone learn it? To a degree, Hiruzen said. Chakra is something that everyone is born with. Some more, some less. Those with enough of it can learn and become ninja, but not without training. Control needs discipline. Naruto took that in wordlessly. There is a place where such training begins. The Ninja Academy. Kids like you who want to learn about it go there to attend, and some later become ninja that work for the village. Hiruzen continued. Naruto stared at him. When will I be able to go? When you're older, Hiruzen said. About 8 years old. Naruto thought about that. It wasn't instant, but it was defined. I'll go, he said. Hiruzen gave a single nod. Secretly glad he wouldn't have to try and convince Naruto to go to the Ninja Academy. Because Naruto didn't have a choice. For his ninja heritage and his container status. But Naruto didn't stop there. Before that, he said, I need information. Hiruzen's eyes moved a bit. What kind of knowledge is it, Naruto-kun? Reading and writing the language is necessary, as at my age we currently haven't been taught to do that. Information about chakra and shinobi. Information about the history of the place I live in and general history of the world. So I am prepared when I attend the academy. The request was exact. Hiruzen looked at him quietly, then allowed the hint of a restrained expression to form. That can be done, he said. A tutor will be sent to teach you about it. You will be given materials about the stuff you have requested and more, if you need it. Naruto nodded. That was enough for now. He needed to know about the world he lived in and how things worked here. After all, knowledge is the key to development. Hiruzen lingered a moment longer, watching him, not like the others. There was something calculated there, something restrained, not acted upon, but not disregarded either. Then he said, You are a clever girl, I will come again, he said. I'd like to see what you learn and how you use it. Naruto met his eyes and nodded. Hiruzen nodded his head slightly, then moved back, the distance coming back as he turned towards the exit. The matron and Daichi went too. The children dispersed and the hall gradually resumed its normal rhythm. Hiruzen found himself back in a quiet office, not empty but settled enough that thought could take shape without interruption. For the moment the noise of the village stayed outside, kept at bay by the walls and the familiarity of the place. He removed the hat as he entered, placing it down with a deliberate movement before setting aside the cloak. The visit had been routine in appearance, but it had not felt routine. Two Anbu stood in the room, their presence unchanged, placed without drawing attention, yet aware of all that had passed. Hiruzen didn't sit down straight away. He stood where he was for a moment, as if letting the impressions of the visit settle before he spoke. He observes more than he should at that age, he said finally, calmly, not being reflective for the sake of it, but because he was grounded in observation. Not just what's on the surface, but what's underneath. Structure, inefficiency, patterns of use rather than intended use. One of the Anbu nodded slightly. The orphanage boy. Not a question, but a check of direction. Naruto, Hiruzen said. The name hung for a moment, not stressed, but not without weight. He doesn't answer like the others do, Hiruzen said, moving toward the desk now, but his attention was still on the talk. He answers when addressed, but the answer is not shaped to satisfy the question. It is shaped by what he has already observed. There is no hesitation, but neither is there an attempt to align himself with expectation. The second Anbu moved slightly at that. That's not normal, he said. At that age children are impressionable and tend to reflect what they are shown. Yes, that is true, Hiruzen answered, taking his seat. He doesn't, he's different from normal kids. Hiruzen paused, then continued. The lamps you saw were not standard design. They had structure where there should have been exposure. The flame was allowed to breathe, but not to fail. We saw, the first Anbu said, they were more stable than anticipated. They were destined to be, Hiruzen said. It's not polished, not perfect, but it works. The same is true of the pump. The mechanism itself is unchanged, but the application of force has been corrected. Less effort, greater output. It's a simple adjustment, but one that had been overlooked. The second Anbu exhaled quietly, not so much in reaction but thought. It means understanding, not copying. It certainly does, Hiruzen said. For a moment the room was still. And the source? The first Anbu asked. Was it a teaching? Hiruzen shook his head a little. No, it was looking. The answer was simple, but it required the general knowledge and brilliance of the child. In use, not in theory, Hiruzen continued. That is not something that is taught at that stage. It is something that is recognized. There was a pause, and in that pause something unspoken fell into place. I've seen it before, Hiruzen said, the tone the same, but the meaning beneath it had changed. The Anbu knew. The second said, Minato. Hiruzen nodded. Not identical, he added, but the approach is similar. The way he isolates a problem. The way he does not overcomplicate the solution once it is understood. The fourth Hokage was considered a once-in-lifetime genius, both in Konoha and outside of it. If that is the case, the first Anbu said after a moment, then leaving him as he is will limit that development. Without guidance and knowledge, that brilliance will ultimately fail. That is a great loss to the village and would be a disservice to the child. Hiruzen nodded a little. He's seen that already, he said. He asked for instruction. Not broad but with direction. Reading, writing knowledge. Chakra theory and historical knowledge. Basic foundational knowledge but enough to build from. That caused a momentary shift in the room. He asked for it himself, the second Anbu said. Yes. There was no need for further explanation. That's already there. We just have to build on it, the first Anbu said quietly. Hiruzen did not reply immediately, but the acknowledgement was clear. After a moment he said, it shall be arranged. Not in a system, individually. The conversation shifted a little then, not away from Naruto, but toward what extended from it. And the design? Asked the second Anbu. If the lamps can be replicated, they could be useful outside the orphanage. Civilian areas have instability in that respect. They can be copied, Hiruzen said, but not without cooperation. The materials must be uniform. The structure must be preserved. It will require the smith and the glassmaker. That can be done, answered the first Anbu. Hiruzen gave a single nod. Do it. Small implementation. Watch the results before expanding more. The instruction was explicit. There was a pause, then the second Anbu spoke again, his tone unchanged, but the question carried more weight this time. How did he get to it? He asked. That high of an application? Hiruzen didn't answer right away. He sees, he said, after a while. And he responds to what he sees. That's enough for now. It was not a full answer but it was the only one he meant to give before he'd confirmed any ideas. The child was unusually knowledgeable of practical applications. It was similar to Minato and unfortunately one of his students, Orochimaru. Hiruzen grimaced at that. Yes, but he hadn't seen that level of practical applications yet. The room fell silent again, and then Hiruzen spoke again. Send for Crow. The instruction did not need repeating. A third presence entered moments later, silent, controlled. The shift in space signaled his arriving more than any movement he could make visible. He dropped to his knees, no hesitation. Hokage-sama. Hiruzen looked at him for a moment and then said, "Stand." Crow got up. "Itachi Uchiha, there is an assignment," Hiruzen said, his tone unchanged, though the direction of the conversation shifted clearly. "You'll begin tutoring a kid in the civilian orphanage. Basic education. Reading, writing and introductory theory." Itachi listened without interruption, but he was not entirely focused. "A civilian child?" he asked, not doubting the order, but clarifying the context of it. "For now," Hiruzen answered. It was a deliberate distinction, he thought, briefly. "Is there a special reason why I'm being put on this?" "There is," Hiruzen said. He paused for a moment, not for effect, but to be clear about what was coming next. "The child is not behaving as expected," he said. "He observes, but he doesn't take part. He stands aside, even when there's no reason to. Instruction alone won't fix that." Crow's eyes lowered, not in submission, but in thought. "You want more than instruction," he said. "Yes." The answer was easy. "He needs someone who understands that distance," Hiruzen continued. "He needs guidance. Not tutoring. Someone who can guide and help him along. Not hinder his individual thought." Crow did not answer immediately, but the implication was clear. "And you think I can give that?" asked he. "In the Uchiha clan, many believe what they are taught. They follow their elder, their teachers. Only some rise above that structure, they watch the world and reach their independent conclusions. Madara, Kagami, Mikoto, Shishui and you Itachi, I have observed to be of those people. Thus, I believe you can teach and guide Naruto. I believe you to be capable of it," Hiruzen replied. There was no further elaboration. Itachi accepted. "The child," he said after a pause. "Who is he?" Hiruzen's gaze never left. "Naruto Uzumaki." The name was placed. Itachi didn't flinch, but the significance was present. "There are tensions in the clan," Crow said after a moment, his tone changing slightly as he spoke of something parallel and not unrelated. "They're on the rise. I am aware of the Uchiha's dissatisfaction with the village and the current governing system," Itachi, Hiruzen answered. "It's going to take some work, Hokage-sama, both from you and me," Itachi said. "It will receive it, we will take necessary steps to relive those tensions." The exchange was short, but entire. Itachi cocked his head to the side. "Then I will begin at once." Hiruzen nodded. He stepped back, and disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. The room went quiet again. Hiruzen sat a moment longer, his eyes unfocused, not on anything in the room but on something carried forward from the orphanage. The name stuck, not as a title or responsibility, but more personal than he let it be. Naruto, he did not dwell on it. For the present the way was to get guidance from his tutor and perhaps later he could go and see for himself what he made out of that knowledge. But there were other things to be dealt with for the time being. XXXXXXX night settled over the orphanage without announcing itself, the routines carrying the children from movement to stillness as before, in the same quiet order. The lamps did not flicker now, nor their light waver in passing drafts. They shone steadily over the room as the last of the voices died away. One by one the children fell asleep, their breathing at first ragged, then falling into a common rhythm. Naruto lay where he had been assigned, still with them, but not yet at rest. The memory had stayed with him since the Hokage's visit. It had not returned by itself, neither faded. It hung there in a don't avoid it if you can help, not pushy, not finished. The fragments he had seen were clear in parts, but without context they held no stable meaning, and time had not resolved the absence. He turned inside. Not abruptly, not violently. Once it surfaced it could again, but not by strain. It would have to be remembered properly, not chased. Naruto closed his eyes and let the external settle, letting the sounds of the room recede into the background. He did not altogether keep them out. He just put them aside. Then he began to draw what he had seen. The Hokage in his battle attire, the unworldly presence behind him, the pale man cursing out his old teacher, standing in front of him. He focused on the space that wasn't there. On the light that was not the light of flame. He hung on to the feeling of watching, not being there. He did not force it but let the memory come on its own. This time the memory came back more steadily. It didn't break up as it had before. First the enclosed space, then the awareness of sitting, older than he was now, facing something that carried motion within a fixed frame. A television. The picture matched the word. His other understanding was more firmly settled this time, as he had been watching something on the TV. He wasn't living those images, he wasn't physically there in those images, but he was watching them as a third person. The scene reformed, more stable this time. The barrier. The two figures inside it. Orochimaru and Hiruzen facing each other. Hiruzen's body already straining, but not broken in intent. The thing behind him was enormous and unnatural and had no place in the physical world, but it was here with him anyway. This time the memory did not collapse. It continued. The method. The words were spoken. The look on Hiruzen's face as he went ahead with it, whatever the cost. It was not victory that marked the moment, but acceptance. A conclusion reached, not then, but long before it. Naruto didn't react, he held on to the memory, and then it expanded, not alone this time the scene. Other moments started to emerge, not as pieces, but as parts of something bigger, something structured. The same figures reappeared, not discrete but in sequence, their actions carrying continuity from one moment to the next. A young boy standing alone, apart from others, his presence not wanted in a place that should have been his home. Naruto knew him immediately, not because he was told, but because the name matched the image, it was himself. Then, a forest, movement through trees. A test, but not a test. Bells. A masked man watching, not interfering, letting failure teach 3 children what instruction alone could not, teaching them teamwork. Then another scene, the same boy, but older now, standing against another child with pale eyes, both moving with intent and not instinct. The clash was brief, but it was not without meaning beyond the moment itself. Rivalry, recognition. The sequences continued, each moment adding to the last. A bridge that had disappeared into the fog, tension thick in the air before the clash of battle broke out. A man wielding a blade that was far bigger than it should have been, another one beside him whose presence just didn't feel right for the role he was thrown into. The result wasn't pretty, it was soaked in loss. Another alteration. A forest again, but different, denser and darker. Ominous in way that could be felt all around. A figure emerging from that darkness. His presence unnatural, his intent controlled but not hidden. Orochimaru. Naruto held onto those memories, he wouldn't let them go, more came. An arena. Crowds. Watching from above. A test that was no longer just a test, but something being watched for reasons beyond what was stated. Then, destruction. The village under attack. The same man he had just seen, Hiruzen, standing again, not as a visitor, but as its protector. The battle he had already witnessed now carried context. It was not isolated, it was a part of this. Naruto's breath did not falter. The memories did not drown aligned, each one linking to the next, forming something that was no longer uncertain. This was not a bunch of random images, it was a story. Structured and continuous seen by him on a screen. It was a realization that came about slowly, not as a conclusion but as something that clicked into place when enough of it had been seen. He had known this before. Not in this life. In another life. Again the word came up, anime. The meaning was there, no explanation necessary. Something watched and followed. A constructed narrative. Naruto opened his eyes. The room came back, just as it had been. The same dim light, the same soft breathing of other children asleep in their beds. Nothing around him reflected what had just been settled into position. But the understanding did not go away. This world was the same as that. Not like. The same. Naruto didn't move. His thoughts were falling into place, not racing ahead but steadying themselves around what he'd learned. The memory was incomplete. There were holes. Details not found. But the structure was so clear that confirmation was no longer needed. Naruto Uzumaki. Now the name had clout. Not just as identity, but as a position, a role. He gave no outward sign of it. He was shocked by the information, but the information itself didn't demand any immediate action. And he was born into this world already, nothing can be done about it anyways, he concluded. If what he had seen was within the path of this world then they were not random. They had a pattern, one we'd already seen. Which meant they were foreseeable. And if they could be foreseen, then they could also be changed. He didn't need to think further than that for the moment, there was too much he didn't know, too many things that were still unconfirmed. But that was enough. For now the possibility was there. Then another memory came, not part of the sequence, softer, closer, not part of the structure, but part of him. Warmth. His arms around his mother around him. Naruto, she said with love, he knew without seeing her well. Red hair. A mother who needed no explanation. Kushina. That was his mother's name and he loved her. That was legit. His father, Minato. His love and sacrifice for him was real. He could not remember his parents from past La Femme, but in this one he had felt their love for him. That thought anchored him down. Naruto exhaled slowly. Not in relief, but as something clicked into place. Whatever this was, whatever it was that had happened, it didn't change what he was now. He was here. In this world and in this life. As Naruto Uzumaki. That was the fact, he would figure out the rest in time. He closed his eyes again, not to return to the memory, but to let it sink into its rightful place. There was no need to compel what was not clear. He would go back to it, piece by piece, and understand them properly. And when he did, he would choose what was to be changed. He had seen enough for the present to begin. Sorry, I can't give this information because implies requesting details about illegal activities or substances. If you need resources about public policies to avoid illegal activities, I can give this information for academic purposes. Nothing had changed in the orphanage the following days, but it did not feel the same to Naruto anymore. The routines went on as before, the children's movements governed by habit not choice, the matrons keeping order with the same measured distance. Outwardly nothing had changed. Same walls. Same schedules. Same quiet separation. Always about him. But his comprehension of the world within it had altered. What he had seen the night before had not gone away. Instead it had steadied, no longer unstable, no longer uncertain. The memories were not complete in detail, but complete enough in structure. The world he was in was no longer unknown to him, and that altered the way he saw everything in it. He did nothing, there was no need. First was observation, then understanding soon followed. There would be actions later, but for now he changed nothing outwardly. The sound of footsteps disrupted the morning's rhythm, not loud, but clear enough to distinguish itself from the normal movement inside the orphanage. Naruto turned slowly, not too fast, toward the entrance, focusing his attention. Naruto hadn't seen him come in, the figure was already inside. He was just there, as if he had always been there. He knew this was a ninja, and that alone made him different. The others did not notice at first. It was the matrons who noticed him first, their postures altering slightly, not with alarm but with awareness. The caretaker followed, his attention narrowing just enough to confirm what was already understood. Naruto stared at him. The man was young, but no child. He held himself with a control that was not rigid, moved with a precision that was not so studied as to attract notice. His clothing was simple, of a darker tone, practical, but worn with a degree of discipline that suggested training, not routine. There was no unnecessary movement, no wasted motion. Slowly he approached. Naruto made no move to meet him. He stopped a few steps away, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Naruto studied him, not just his appearance, but the way he held himself, the way his attention moved, the way he scanned the room in a way unlike a civilian. He didn't search. He recorded. That was obvious. The man talked. "You're Naruto Uzumaki, right?" Naruto nodded. "I have been sent to teach you," the man continued, his tone even, controlled, bearing no excessive emphasis. "You can call me Crow." Naruto met his eyes. Crow. The name fit the presence. It was not personal, it was functional, a designation rather than an identity, and he accepted it without comment. "If you need them, there will be others," Crow added. "For the moment I will start with the basic teaching." Naruto nodded again. That was already in progress. Crow didn't start immediately. He did not look around, he looked with intent. The state of the space. The stuff inside. The materials Naruto had been working with. The changes that had come. Crow's attention turned back to him. "You haven't been taught to read or write," he said. "Not yet," Naruto answered. Crow dipped his head a little. "Then we begin there." He dipped into the fold of his clothing and pulled out a small bundle, wrapped plainly, secured without excess. He opened it, and discovered paper, ink, and a brush neatly arranged. Naruto's eyes have turned to the items. The tools were strange in form, not in function. Crow set them down on a nearby surface, nudging them a little before stepping back, creating space without having to say so. He said, "The written language consists of characters." His tone was steady, not instructional in the sense of explanation, but direct in function. Each has meaning in form as well as in sound. Crow picked up the brush, dipped it in the ink and set it to the paper. The movement was measured, each stroke purposeful, creating a character that held form without distortion. Naruto watched carefully. It's the process, not the result. Pressure. Angle sequence. Crow put down the brush when he was done with the character. "You're going to copy it." Naruto took a step forward. He took the brush, adjusted his grip slightly and put it on the paper. The first stroke was not consistent, the line uneven where the pressure moved. But he did not stop there, he corrected and adjusted where he could. The next stroke had more control. Then another. After some time he had finished the character, and taken up the brush, looking from what he had written to the original. There had been differences, but the structure had held. Crow watched, undisturbed. Again, he said. Naruto did it again, each time the deviation growing less. Not perfect, but slowly. Progressively. He did not ask for correction, he corrected where he thought there was an error. Crow watching and observing the corrections. Naruto went on, the repetition not mechanical, but deliberate, each iteration tweaking what had been observed before. You learn by refining, Crow said after a while. Naruto didn't answer, it was consistent with what he was already doing. Crow introduced the next character, then another, each building on the last without overloading the process. The progression was still measured, not hurried, so that understanding was built along with repetition. Naruto followed. His gaze was fixed. The outside world did not intrude, only the structure before him. Crow put down the brush at some point. That's enough, he said. Naruto looked up. Crow glanced at him for a moment. His gaze was steady, not intrusive, but attentive in a way that hadn't changed since he'd arrived. You asked for knowledge, he said. Naruto nodded. Crow delved into the bundle again and this time produced several books, simply bound, their edges worn but intact. They weren't decorative, they were meant to be used. These will form the basis. He set them down. Naruto picked one up, and opened it gently. The characters were not abstract anymore, they could start with this. What are they full of? He asked. Language, said Crow. Basic theory, enough to frame further teaching. Naruto took that in and closed the book. There was more to it than could be understood immediately, but that was to be expected. He did not need to understand immediately. He will study the books and slowly gain knowledge. Crow studied him for a moment. You don't ask any superfluous questions, he said. Naruto looked him in the eye. I ask what is required. Crow tilted his head slightly. That's efficient. The exchange was without tension. Naruto briefly considered that Crow was not like the matrons. Not like the watchmen. He was more restrained and aware. He had control, but it was not imposed but preserved. Crow stepped back. We will continue tomorrow, he said. Look over what you have been given. Don't move beyond what you understand. Naruto nodded. Crow turned, his movement as controlled as before, and left as he had come. He vanished without trace. Naruto sighed and looked down at the materials before him. At the book in his hands. He thought about the way the world had reconfigured itself once more. Not outwards but inwards. He looked at the characters again and then what he wrote. Here there was a system, language, knowledge, structure. And beyond that something bigger. He'd work for it. First understanding, step by step. Then change will happen. But here it began for now.